Arthur Morgan rides alone at dusk. The sky is bleeding out over the horizon, the snow or dust or rain catching the last light as his horse pushes forward, one slow step at a time. No triumphant charge, no roaring gunfight, no grand beginning. Just a man on a tired horse, moving through a world that no longer has a place for him. From the very beginning, Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a story of arrival. It is a story of endings. The West presented here is already dying, already cornered, already fenced in by railroads, telegraph wires, and men with ledgers instead of six-shooters. The world was changing, and the von der Linde gang rides through it as if sheer belief could turn the clock back. Dutch speaks of freedom, of honor, of a better world just over the next hill, but every mile of Arthur's journey at dusk tells a different truth. The old ways were dying, and the men who built their lives on those ways are riding straight into their own extinction. In the truest sense, this is a parable about the death of the Old West and the illusion of freedom that clings to its final outlaws. Dutch's philosophy sounds almost noble at first. Rob the rich, strike back at a corrupt civilization, protect the misfits who have nowhere else to go. A family bound by loyalty, living beyond the reach of governments and corporations. But how long can that dream survive when Pinkertons ride with warrants, when Cornwall's trains carve the land apart, when every valley has a title deed and every river has an owner? Arthur becomes the living embodiment of that question. He is the gang's enforcer, its conscience, and its most lost soul, all at once. Through his eyes, this world is introduced not as a frontier opening up, but as a frontier closing down. The first camp at Coulter is not a base of operations. It is a refuge after a disaster in Blackwater that the gang refuses to truly face. Every new camp that follows, from Horseshoe Overlook to Beaver Hollow, feels less like expansion and more like retreat, a slow spiral from its humble beginnings into poverty, paranoia, and betrayal. This video will trace that entire spiral, from the first meeting of Dutch and Hosea as rival conmen, to the bloody streets of St. Denis, to the frozen peaks and sunburnt plains where the last bullets of this dream are fired. This is their complete story. A story of freedom and family, of dreams and delusions, of loyalty tested and broken as civilization closes its fist. Because Red Dead Redemption 2 is not just a Western, it is a long goodbye to an entire way of life. The question is not how the von der Linde gang began. The question is how a philosophy dies. And that story starts decades before Arthur rides into the dusk, with two men trying to rob each other in a small, forgotten town. Two men, two guns, and one terrible punchline. They were trying to rob each other. From its humble beginnings, the von der Linde gang was born out of that absurd moment, a story of mutual deception that somehow became mutual devotion. Dutch von der Linde and Hosea Matthews met in the 1870s, drifting through a frontier already beginning to harden under railroads, telegraphs, and lawmen chasing bounties. Dutch was the preacher without a church, a man with a book in one hand and a revolver in the other, spinning speeches about freedom and dignity. Hosea was the consummate conman, quieter, sharper, the one who saw angles where others saw dead ends. From the very beginning, they recognized something in each other: talent, loneliness, and a shared refusal to kneel before civilization. Together, they built not just a crew, but a family in the truest sense. They took in misfits and runaways, drifters and orphans, anyone the world had decided was worth less than a railroad spike. When Dutch and Hosea found Arthur Morgan as a boy, stealing on the streets after his father's hanging, they did not just see a recruit. They saw a lost soul to raise, a son to mold into the living embodiment of their philosophy. Dutch taught him to read and question, Hosea taught him to hunt and survive, and between them they forged a bond that felt stronger than blood. In those early years, the gang's crimes came wrapped in a story it told itself. They robbed stagecoaches loaded with company payrolls, swindled wealthy landowners, and hit banks that financed the very railroads cutting the prairie into pieces. Dutch insisted they did not prey on the poor. Money was taken from the rich and powerful, he said, to give his people a chance at life. Was it theft or rebellion? To the gang, it was both. They were the last true free men in a world closing in, riding against a tide of fences, factories, and Pinkerton badges. Around the campfire, that myth of noble outlaws sounded almost holy. Dutch spoke of a better world in glowing detail, a place out in the west or across the sea where the gang could live honest, under no one's thumb. Hosea, ever the pragmatist, tempered those dreams with smaller scores and quiet hideouts, but even he was drawn in by the promise of one last big job that would set everyone free. The old ways were dying, Dutch said. Their way would outlast them. Yet even in those golden tales, the cracks were already there. Dutch's speeches grew longer whenever a job went bloodier than planned, as if words could wash away the bodies. Hosea's jokes sometimes hid a worried glance when Dutch pushed a little too hard, stayed a little too long, refused to walk away from a fight he could have avoided. Violence was not just a tool. It flared when Dutch's pride was wounded, when someone dared question his plan. That tension between idealism and ego, between freedom and control, haunted the gang from its earliest days. The world was changing, but Dutch's dream refused to change with it. And the first real test of that dream would come not from a bank or a railroad, but from another gang that believed in its own brutal philosophy just as fiercely. That other philosophy leaves its mark before the story even truly begins. By the time the screen opens on the Blizzard and the Grizzlies, the feud with Colm O'Driscoll has already helped push Dutch toward the decision that breaks his gang's illusion of control. The ferry at Blackwater has gone wrong, people are dead, and the dream is already bleeding out in the snow. The first images at Coulter are not of triumph or freedom, but of exhaustion. Horses stagger through whiteout conditions, lanterns flicker in the dark, and the gang huddles in wagons as the wind howls around them. These are not outlaws riding into a new adventure. These are survivors limping away from a disaster the player never fully sees, already half buried by the storm and by Dutch's refusal to dwell on what was lost. That absence matters. The Blackwater job hangs over every conversation, every shiver, every cough, but it remains a gap in the narrative, a wound the camera never shows. In the truest sense, the story begins not with the heist that was supposed to secure their future, but with its aftermath, with a world already off balance. The gang's legend, from its humble beginnings as an idealistic band of rebels, arrives on screen at the very beginning of its end. In those first hours, Dutch appears to be everything he always claimed to be. He rides at the front, he gives orders, he sends Arthur and Micah into the storm, then Arthur and Javier after John. His voice cuts through the blizzard, promising warmth, safety, a way out. To a freezing, starving family, that certainty is the living embodiment of hope. Who would not follow the man who insists there is still a plan? Yet beneath that commanding presence, the cracks are already visible. Dutch insists that Blackwater was a setup, that they were betrayed, that one more score will fix everything. He improvises constantly, changing stories, shifting blame, promising that this is temporary even as the snow piles higher around the cabins. He refuses to admit that the money left on the boat, the people buried in Blackwater, and the way of life he worships might be gone forever. Coulter becomes a metaphor made of ice and hunger. The gang is trapped between peaks, hemmed in by nature and by the emerging power of civilization that waits below. They are too cold to go back, too proud to surrender, and too stubborn to accept that the old ways were dying long before the ferry exploded into gunfire. Their dream of freedom is now a cramped room, a thin stew, a coughing child. The snow will melt, the gang will ride down from the mountains, and the world will seem open again. But that opening is a lie, and the first real proof of it arrives with the thaw, and with a familiar name riding in the distance. The familiar name is Dutch van der Linde, and with the thaw his dream rides back into focus. In the bitter cold of Coulter, that dream is all the gang has, a promise that this misery is temporary, that beyond the snow waits freedom, family, and a place of their own. Dutch repeats it around the fire until it sounds less like hope and more like doctrine. From the very beginning, Dutch's stated philosophy is disarmingly simple. No kings, no bosses, no government cages. Men and women living honest in their own way, beholden only to each other and to the open land. He speaks of loyalty as the highest virtue, of civilization as a sickness that turns people into numbers and property. In his telling, the gang is not a collection of thieves. It is a story of resistance, of outlaws standing against a rigged world. Dutch frames that world as closing in on them from every direction. Railroads, oil derricks, Pinkertons, and barbed wire fences are, in his speeches, the living embodiment of a deeper betrayal, the promise of America twisted into industry and profit. When he looks at Cornwall's trains or St. Denis's smokestacks, he does not see progress. He sees chains. And around the camp, that rhetoric lands. To a lost soul like Arthur, to a former slave like Lenny, to a dispossessed warrior like Charles, Dutch's words feel in the truest sense like salvation. He calls their robberies requisitions, their ambushes levies on the rich and corrupt. A blown-up train is framed as a message. A stagecoach robbery is a tax on greed. In his mouth, every crime becomes a political act. Every shot fired another step toward a better world. How different does that sound from the reality the game quietly shows? The wrecked carriages, the dead guards begging in the snow, the passengers screaming as bullets punch through glass. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clements Point, the gap between Dutch's dream and Dutch's actions begins to widen. He speaks of laying low, of one last big score and then a ranch in Tahiti or some other paradise. Yet his plans grow louder and bloodier. A simple ferry job becomes the Blackwater disaster. A quick bank robbery in St. Denis turns into Hosea and Lenny dying on marble floors while Dutch shouts about destiny. That is the turning point. His dream may have started sincere, born from its humble beginnings as a rough philosophy shared between two conmen, but with each failure it becomes more about protecting the image of Dutch van der Linde than protecting his people. Why admit the plan is broken when it is easier to say the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and only he can save what remains? Every new camp after Coulter marks another compromise, another escalation in his delusions. The more the gang bleeds, the more Dutch insists he has a plan, and soon, a new voice will whisper in his ear, telling him he is right. And in the middle of Dutch's swelling delusions stands the man who makes those plans real. Arthur Morgan is the hand that pulls the trigger, the fist that collects the debt, the quiet shadow that turns Dutch's philosophy into blood and broken bones. From the very beginning, Arthur has been framed as Dutch's true believer, not in speeches but in action. When Dutch says a bank needs robbing, Arthur rides. When Dutch declares a town corrupt, Arthur is the one who walks through its streets with a shotgun and a bandana, the living embodiment of the gang's promise of freedom through force. Dutch dreams. Arthur enforces. This role is not an accident. It is a story of upbringing, of loyalty, of a boy raised in a world where crime is not just survival but identity. Arthur's father dies a petty outlaw, and Dutch steps into that void. He teaches Arthur to read, to quote books, to see civilization as the real criminal. Hosea tempers that with pragmatism, teaching him to track, to fish, to recognize when a deal is rotten. Between them, they do not just train a gunman, they raise a son. For Arthur, Dutch's approval becomes the measure of manhood. Masculinity, in the truest sense for him, is not about tenderness or doubt, but about riding into gunfire without hesitation, about doing the ugly work so Dutch can keep speaking about ideals. The gang is his family, the camp his home, the outlaw trail his entire world. Abandoning that would mean abandoning himself. Yet from its humble beginnings, there are cracks. Arthur's journal is the first betrayal of his own legend. On the surface, he is the gruff enforcer, the man who jokes about killing and shrugs off death. On the page, he is reflective, almost gentle, sketching the faces of the people around him, questioning Dutch's choices, wondering if the dream is slipping away. The same hands that beat debtors half to death also carefully draw a rabbit, a landscape, a woman's face. In camp, another side emerges. Arthur carries Jack on his shoulders, teases Abigail, looks out for Mary Beth and Tilly, quietly defers to Grimshaw's authority. He protects the weak, even as he terrorizes strangers. He can threaten a farmer in the morning and rescue a runaway in the afternoon. It is almost ironic. The gang's most feared enforcer is also the one who most consistently behaves like an older brother. So what happens when that man, who believes he is just doing his job, starts to see the cost of that job on the people he loves? When every new camp, every new grave, and every broken promise forces him to read his own journal not as a record of adventure, but as evidence of a long, slow betrayal, the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur Morgan will be forced to decide whether his loyalty belongs to Dutch's dream or to the living, breathing family trapped inside it. For Arthur, the answer to that question is never found in a speech or a gunfight. It is found in the quiet rhythm of camp, in the clatter of plates, the crackle of fire, the low murmur of stories drifting through the pines while someone picks out a rough melody on a battered guitar. The story of the van der Linde gang is not only written in blood and robbery, but in coffee pots, worn blankets, and shared cigarettes passed from hand to hand. From its humble beginnings as two conmen and a boy, the camp becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's promise, a place where outlaws, runaways, and misfits can sit at the same table and be called family. In the truest sense, daily life here feels almost domestic. Pearson grumbles over stew, Tilly and Mary Beth trade gossip, Uncle pretends to work while doing almost nothing at all. Children run between tents, dogs sleep in the shade, and for a moment the world beyond the lantern light feels distant, almost unreal. Around the fire, every voice carries a different history, a different hope. Hosea tells long, winding stories about old cons and lost fortunes, his humor masking the quiet ache of a man who knows the old ways were dying. John sits on the edge of the circle, half in shadow, trying to prove he belongs, while Abigail pushes him to think of Jack's future instead of Dutch's philosophy. Charles, calm and watchful, moves through camp repairing tools and mending wounds. a reminder that survival is more than bravado. Even Sadie, still raw from grief, begins to laugh again as she learns to live as an outlaw on her own terms. Yet beneath the music and laughter, something tightens. Money is always short, the ledger always thin, and the talk around the stew pot keeps circling back to the same question: the next score, the next move, the next miracle that will finally let them stop running. Dutch walks through camp with that familiar refrain on his lips, promising that he has a plan, that freedom is just one more job away. But every new camp, from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point to Shady Bell, feels a little poorer, a little more desperate, a little less like home. Lawmen and Pinkertons haunt the edges of this fragile peace. Riders pass on the horizon, trains scream in the distance, smokestacks rise where forests once stood. The world was changing, and civilization, backed by oil barons and railroads, is closing in on their hidden clearings. No one says it aloud, but everyone feels it. Each song, each shared meal might be the last. Because what they are truly afraid of losing is not just freedom from prisons and gallows. It is the only family many of them have ever known, the only place where a lost soul can be something more than a name on a wanted poster. Camp is their refuge, their identity, their fragile claim that this life is still a story of loyalty rather than betrayal. And as Dutch's plans grow bolder and bloodier, that little circle of firelight will become the battleground, where those dreams and those delusions finally collide. But that little circle of firelight is surrounded by something much larger and far less forgiving. Beyond the songs, beyond the stories, the world was changing in ways no camp meeting could hold back. The first enemy does not arrive with a badge or a warrant, but with rails. Steel lines carve across the plains, dragging the country into a new century, one locomotive at a time. Towns like Valentine and St. Denis expand, brick by brick, over the bones of the Old West, swallowing the open range in smoke and electric light. Oil derricks claw at the sky, black wells of profit rising where herds once moved and where men like Arthur once believed freedom could be found at the end of a horizon. From its humble beginnings as scattered settlements and lonely trails, this world is becoming a grid. Trains are not just background scenery. They are the living embodiment of a different philosophy, a story of order, schedule, and profit that runs directly against Dutch's dream of wandering outlaw freedom. Every robbery the gang pulls on those tracks is an act of defiance, but also an admission. The very beginning of each plan relies on the system Dutch claims to despise. Without the timetable, without the payroll car, there is nothing to steal, nothing to resist. Where the trains go, the Pinkertons follow. Milton and Ross do not hunt the gang as personal rivals. They move as instruments of a state that has finally decided the age of independent outlaws is over. Their power is not in a single gunfight, but in surveillance, in files, in the slow tightening of a net that stretches from Blackwater's docks to the alleys of St. Denis. They always know more than they should. They always arrive sooner than they ought to. Is it really just bad luck? Or the consequence of an entire civilization learning how to watch and record and control? Standing behind those agents is another kind of authority: corporate money. Leviticus Cornwall is not a mustache-twirling caricature. He is a banker's ledger given human form, a man who sees land, oil, and railroads as one continuous vein to be mined. When Dutch blows up Cornwall's train, when the gang attacks his refinery and his men, they are not simply robbing a rich target. They are declaring war on a system that can replace every dead guard, every burned carriage, with more capital, more men, more law. Dutch insists the struggle is him versus the law, one brilliant outlaw against a corrupt government. But the real antagonist is colder and far less personal. It is a changing economic and political order that has no place for wandering camps, improvised families, or men who refuse to sign their names on someone else's payroll. The old ways were dying, not because Dutch failed to plan, but because the very ground beneath his philosophy was being bought, fenced, and litigated out from under him. In the truest sense, the Von der Linde gang is not only running from Pinkertons, it is running from history itself. And as the pressure mounts, that history will force every member of this outlaw family to decide: adapt, submit, or be crushed. That flight from history has a name: Blackwater. From its humble beginnings, the Von der Linde gang had taken risks, but the Blackwater job was different. This was not a dusty bank or a stagecoach on a lonely road. It was a ferry in a growing town on the edge of civilization, loaded with civilians, watched by lawmen, and carrying a fortune in bonds that could have funded Dutch's dream of freedom for years. The plan was bold, theatrical, the living embodiment of Dutch's belief that the world still had room for grand gestures. It went wrong almost immediately, Pinkertons were waiting, the law was organized, and in the chaos, the ferry became a killing ground. Civilians died, gang members were shot. The money went to the bottom of the lake or into government hands. The details forever hazy, retold in fragments around campfires and in bitter arguments. What remains clear is simple. The gang ran, leaving bodies and a fortune behind, and from that moment on, they were not roaming outlaws. They were hunted fugitives. The game never shows this massacre. There is no playable prologue on the ferry, no cinematic of the first bullet, no neat reconstruction. Instead, Blackwater hangs over everything as a story of failure that no one wants to recount in full. Dutch dodges specifics. Hosea grows quiet. Arthur recalls only flashes and consequences. The absence becomes its own presence, a wound the gang refuses to stare at directly, because to do so would mean admitting that the dream died there, in smoke and gunfire and screaming civilians. This is why Dutch cannot let it go. His obsession with the Blackwater money is not just greed, it is denial. If the money can still be recovered, then the plan was not a mistake. If the plan was not a mistake, then his philosophy still holds, his leadership is still justified, and the world was changing only in ways he could outsmart. Over and over, he insists that once they get back to Blackwater, everything will be fixed. A single score will heal betrayal, erase blood, reverse time. It is delusion dressed as strategy. In the truest sense, Blackwater is the invisible turning point of this entire story. Before it, the gang could pretend to be romantic bandits living just outside civilization. After it, every camp, from the frozen misery of Coulter to the rot of Beaver Hollow, marks a step deeper into desperation. The old ways were dying, and instead of adapting, Dutch clings to a ghost at the bottom of a lake. The tragedy is that this ghost does not only haunt Dutch, it will reach into Arthur's conscience, John's future, and the final, brutal choices that will determine who escapes this outlaw family and who goes down with its lost soul of a leader. Because if Blackwater was the death of the dream, what happens when the gang finally admits it? For that answer, the story turns back to the man who had been questioning the dream from the very beginning. Hosea Matthews was Dutch's oldest friend, his first partner, and in the truest sense, the quiet architect of the Van der Linde gang. If Dutch was the voice, Hosea was the mind. If Dutch was the fire, Hosea was the hand on the bellows, deciding how high the flames should rise. From its humble beginnings, this was not just a gang of outlaws, but a partnership born in irony. Two con men trying to rob each other, then laughing and splitting the take. Hosea and Dutch built a philosophy on that moment, a belief that the world was rigged and that clever men could live free by outsmarting civilization rather than bowing to it. Hosea helped choose the targets, plan the robberies, and shape the family that grew around them. He taught Arthur to track, to hunt, to read the land, grounding Dutch's lofty speeches in the hard reality of how to stay alive. Yet even in the early days, Hosea's dreams were smaller, quieter, more honest. He married Bessie and tried to settle down in the Grizzlies, proof that some part of him wanted a different ending. When she died, something in Hosea broke, but it did not turn into Dutch's rage. It turned into caution. He still believed in the gang, still loved Dutch with a stubborn loyalty, but he understood something Dutch refused to face. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying faster than any of them could ride. That is why Hosea's plans almost always point in another direction. While Dutch chases grand scores, a bank in St. Denis, a ferry in Blackwater, Hosea pushes for small, sustainable cons. Selling bogus moonshine under the noses of Lemoyne raiders, staging a fake art auction, running clever swindles that end with embarrassment rather than bloodshed. His schemes aim for enough money to disappear, not enough to remake the world. Where Dutch wants to be the living embodiment of resistance, Hosea just wants a cabin by a lake and the chance to grow old. This tension becomes the gang's hidden fault line. Dutch insists that one last big job will buy their freedom. Hosea insists that survival lies in shrinking the dream before it devours them. Who is right? The tragedy is that the answer arrives not in an argument, but in a gunshot. When Hosea dies in St. Denis, Dutch does not just lose a friend. He loses his conscience, his strategist, the only man who could still look him in the eye and say, no. From that moment on, Dutch's philosophy spins unchallenged, circling deeper into delusion. With Hosea gone and Micah whispering poison, the gang's future darkens, and every plan becomes a cliff they are all forced to walk toward together. With Hosea gone, and Dutch's voice echoing through the trees, the gang does not just lose its mind. It loses its memory of what this life was supposed to protect. That absence throws one relationship into sharp relief. John, Abigail, and Jack, a family trying to exist inside a camp that worships freedom but fears responsibility. From the very beginning, John Marston is not only an outlaw, he is a partner and a father pulled in two directions, standing between the firelight of the gang and the fragile shelter of his own tent. Dutch calls him a son, Arthur calls him a brother, and yet Abigail keeps reminding him that he already has a family, one that cannot ride away when the bullets start flying. John's constant disappearances, his injuries, his half-hearted promises to change, all reveal a man torn between loyalty to the dream and duty to the people that dream keeps hurting. Abigail's frustration cuts through the romantic haze that surrounds the Von der Linde camp. She has lived the speeches, the robberies, the winters in the mountains, and the empty talk of one last score more times than she can count. When she snaps at John for chasing Dutch's plans instead of raising Jack, the gang's philosophy is exposed in the truest sense. This is a story of men preaching about family, while leaving an actual family alone by the fire. The irony is almost cruel. In a world where the old ways were dying, the only person insisting on food, safety, and a roof is branded selfish, while the men risking everything for a doomed ideal call themselves noble. Jack, meanwhile, is the living embodiment of what might have been. He reads, he plays, he dreams of stories and civilization, not gunsmoke and train robberies. When he is kidnapped in Rhodes, the gang rages and rides out, but that crisis also reveals how little protection their way of life truly offers. What kind of freedom is it when a child is always one bad decision away from being a bargaining chip? Jack's innocence turns the camp into a mirror, reflecting not just danger, but the selfishness baked into every choice to stay in the life one more day. John's struggle in 1899 only gains weight when seen alongside the man he becomes in Red Dead Redemption. In both games, his arc is a story of running in circles, first from the gang, then from the government, then from the past that refuses to stay buried. He tries to build a ranch, to live quietly with Abigail and Jack, to trade gunfights for fence posts. Yet the cycle of violence follows him across the years and across both games. From its humble beginnings as a boy rescued by Dutch, his life bends toward one question: can a man raised by outlaws ever truly lay his guns down? That question haunts Arthur and Dutch as well, even if they refuse to face it. If a man as stubborn, proud, and wounded as John can at least attempt to walk away, what does it say about Dutch, who clings to his collapsing philosophy? Or Arthur, who waits so long to admit the dream is dead? As the world was changing around them, John's faltering steps toward Abigail and Jack hint at another path, one that costs more than money and blood. It costs the myth of who these men believe they are. The tragedy is that by the time that path becomes clear, for most of them, it is already too late. For Dutch, that realization comes not as a clean break, but as a temptation. When the dream of a better world starts to crumble, he does not abandon it. He finds someone willing to tell him it was right all along. That someone rides into the story late, grinning, eager, and already poisoned to the core: Micah Bell. From its humble beginnings, the gang had been guided by a rough balance. Dutch dreamed and preached, Hosea questioned and planned, Arthur enforced and doubted, John drifted and slowly tried to grow. Micah is the first major arrival who owes nothing to that history of compromise. He appears in 1898 after Blackwater, as the world was changing and Dutch's confidence is shaken, and he does the one thing no one else in camp can bear to do anymore. He flatters Dutch without restraint. Micah calls Dutch a genius, a prophet, a man too big for this dying civilization. Where Hosea urges small scores and retirement, Micah whispers of one last grand robbery that will prove Dutch's philosophy in the truest sense. Where Arthur warns of Pinkertons and Cornwall's railroads and oil, Micah laughs and insists that fear is for lesser men. Take what can be taken, kill who must be killed, never look back. It is brutal, simple, and intoxicating. In that way, Micah is the living embodiment of Dutch's rhetoric stripped of its idealistic dressing. Dutch has always talked about freedom, about resisting the rich and corrupt, about giving the poor a fighting chance. Yet from the very beginning, the gang robbed trains, banks, and coaches not to build a new society, but to keep running from the old ways we're dying. Micah's philosophy makes no apology for this. He calls greed survival, cruelty strength, and betrayal pragmatism. As the camps move from Horseshoe to Clemens Point, from Shady Bell to Beaver Hollow, those fractures become impossible to ignore. Dutch listens less to Hosea's caution and more to Micah's bravado, and every new plan grows larger, bloodier, more desperate. Hosea argues for lying low. Micah pushes St. Denis. Arthur questions the Tahiti fantasy. Micah urges Dutch to shoot, to burn, to disappear into the chaos. John, who once wanted to be Dutch's heir, finds himself dismissed as ungrateful and weak, while Micah is praised as loyal. Yet Micah does not create this downfall, he accelerates it. He feeds Dutch the version of himself Dutch most wants to believe in, the fearless outlaw leader, untouched by doubt, betrayed only by a shrinking world. Is it any surprise Dutch clings to the man who tells him the dream was never wrong, only unfinished? The tragedy is that by the time the gang realizes what Micah truly is, the rot he represents has already spread. The question that remains is not whether he will betray them, it is how many will follow him over the edge before they finally see what he has turned Dutch into. By the time Micah's poison has taken hold, the question is no longer who betrayed the gang, but what betrayed them. Was it one man with a silver tongue and a hidden agenda, or a dream that was doomed from the very beginning? For Dutch, the answer would always be the same: freedom. His philosophy promised a world with no laws, no bosses, no government papers, no obligations beyond loyalty to the campfire and the people around it. In Dutch's speeches, the gang was not just a pack of thieves. It was the living embodiment of resistance, a family bound together against a corrupt civilization that had forgotten what freedom meant. Robbing banks became protest. Shooting Pinkertons became self-defense in the truest sense. But the reality those men and women woke up to each morning was far less poetic. Freedom, for the Van der Linde gang, meant freezing in the snow at Coulter, hiding in the trees at Horseshoe Overlook, packing up in the dead of night at Clemens Point when the noose tightened. It meant Shady Bell's rotting halls and Beaver Hollow's choking air, where disease, paranoia, and hunger stalked every firelit conversation. They were always running, always hiding, always killing. Their so-called independence depended entirely on stolen money, borrowed time, and plans that fell apart as quickly as Dutch could promise. I have a plan. This is where the story of the gang widens into a story of America. Dutch's fantasy of the open frontier, of men carving out their own fate with a gun and a horse, echoes the great national myths about the West: rugged individualism, self-reliance, the belief that beyond the next ridge lies a valley untouched by rules. Yet in 1899, the world was changing. Railroads cut through the wilderness, oil derricks scarred the horizon, and Pinkertons carried the law in their pockets. The old ways were dying, not because Dutch failed to believe hard enough, but because capital and government power had already fenced off the dream. In that sense, Dutch is not just an outlaw leader. He is a lost soul clinging to a story the world has outgrown. His campfire speeches promise freedom, family, and honor, but his actions deliver debt, betrayal, and graves. Arthur's coughing fits, Hosea's warnings, John's desperate attempts to leave for Abigail and Jack all press against that illusion. How free is a man who cannot stop moving? How independent is a philosophy that collapses the moment the money runs out? The tragedy of the Van der Linde gang is not simply that they lose. It is that what they are chasing never truly exists in the way they imagine. Their better world is always one more score away, always hidden in some distant land with a new name. Tahiti, Australia, one last ride west. Each promise pushes them further from the small, imperfect lives they might actually have lived. And as the story moves toward its end, the question shifts from whether they can reach that promised freedom to who, if anyone, will finally admit that the dream itself was the greatest lie of all. For Dutch and Arthur, the lie is not just the dream of Tahiti. The deeper lie is what it means to be a man in a world that no longer wants men like them. From the very beginning, their philosophy of freedom is tangled up with an idea of manhood built on defiance, on never backing down, on riding straight at the gunfire rather than stepping aside. Dutch preaches that real men stand tall against civilization, against government, against the rich. He turns stubbornness into virtue, recklessness into courage. To hesitate is to be weak. To walk away is to betray the family. That is why every setback only hardens his resolve. Each failure demands a bigger gesture, a louder speech, a wilder plan. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's response is to double down on the very impulses dragging the gang towards the cliff. Arthur absorbs this from his mentor in the truest sense. His whole life is a story of proving himself tough enough, loyal enough, brutal enough to be Dutch's right hand. When Hosea suggests small scores and retirement, Arthur often scoffs, because the quiet life feels lesser, diminished, unmanly. What is a ranch or a shop compared to riding with a legendary outlaw, the living embodiment of resistance? To admit the dream is over would mean admitting that the years of killing and running were not a grand crusade, but a long, bloody mistake. That is why the idea of laying down arms terrifies them more than Pinkertons do. When John wants to leave for Abigail and Jack, Dutch frames it as cowardice. Arthur initially agrees, mocking John's desire for a home as if it were weakness. To these men, being a husband and father is somehow smaller than being a gun. The irony is brutal. They claim to fight for family, yet they treat actual family as a distraction from the real work of being men. The women in camp see through this performance. Abigail does not romanticize the outlaw life, she calls it what it is, a cycle that will leave Jack an orphan. When she confronts Dutch and Arthur, her anger cuts deeper than any bullet because it names their pride. Sadie, forged in grief, embraces violence, yet even she understands that Dutch's endless plans are not strength, but fear wearing a fancy coat. She wants vengeance, not delusions. And Karen, drunk at the fire, laughs at Dutch's speeches long before the others dare to, her mockery hinting that the emperor of the gang has no clothes. Arthur's redemption is a story of masculinity unlearned. As his illness forces him to face his own end, toughness stops meaning how many men he can kill and starts meaning how much truth he can bear. Can he admit Dutch is wrong? Can he apologize to John? Can he choose to save a family instead of a fantasy? Real strength becomes the courage to let go, to walk away, to accept that freedom might look less like a gun in the hand and more like a chance for someone else to live better. In that final choice, the outlaw finally becomes a man. But even as the outlaw becomes a man, the world around him is becoming something else entirely. The gang's tragedy is not only a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but of a frontier closing its doors while they are still standing on the threshold, insisting it must remain open. From the very beginning of their flight after Blackwater, the contrast is stark. In the mountains at Coulter, at Horseshoe Overlook, at Clemens Point, the campfires glow against dark trees and open sky. Tents flap in the wind, coffee boils over a simple pot, and the gang can still pretend that freedom means a horse, a gun, and a road with no end. Out there, the old ways were dying, but they could still be rehearsed. It is a world of stories told by firelight, not written down. Then St. Denis appears, almost as if another civilization has been dropped onto the same map. Electric lights hum above crowded streets, trams rattle past in iron grooves, and smoke from factories blots out the stars that once guided drifters. Dutch and the others ride in from the swamps covered in mud, and suddenly they are not dangerous legends. They are dirty men blocking traffic, the living embodiment of a past the city has already priced, taxed, and moved beyond. The details make it unavoidable. Telephones ring in rich men's offices, allowing orders and arrests to travel faster than any horse. Cameras flash in the streets, freezing faces on glass and paper, turning every crime into evidence and every outlaw into a record. Newspapers scream headlines about Blackwater, about St. Denis, about the Van der Linde gang by name. In a world that writes everything down, who can still vanish into the sunset? Industrialization does not just scar the landscape with rails and smokestacks. It rewrites who gets to survive. Men like Cornwall do not need to draw a gun. They own the trains, the oil, the Pinkertons. They wage war with contracts and telegrams while Arthur and Dutch still talk about robbing a stagecoach as if that can compete. Freedom itself is being redefined, away from the saddle and toward the bank ledger. In this changing world, the gang becomes a relic in the truest sense. Their camp rituals, their wandering philosophy, their faith in wide open spaces all belong to a time that has already ended everywhere except in their minds. Dutch keeps insisting that the world was changing in his favor, that one last score will buy them a new frontier, but the trains keep arriving and the wires keep humming. So the question shifts. Not whether the gang can outrun the law, but whether any outlaw can exist in a world that has learned how to remember everything. And as the noose of civilization tightens, another force begins to move in the shadows, ready to make that question brutally clear. That tightening noose is the real subject of this story. Not just the Pinkertons, not just one traitor in camp, but a world closing its fist around a dream that never truly fit inside it. From the very beginning, Red Dead Redemption 2 frames the Van der Linde gang as more than a pack of thieves on the run. They are the living embodiment of a fantasy, that a handful of outlaws, bound by loyalty and a shared philosophy, can outride civilization itself. Yet the world was changing. Telegraph wires cut across the plains, railroads carved through mountains, and men like Leviticus Cornwall bought law and government in the same breath. The old ways were dying, even as Dutch promised that one more score would somehow resurrect them. This is, in the truest sense, a story of a family built on shared illusions. Dutch's crumbling dream of freedom, Hosea's hope for a quiet retirement, Arthur's belief that loyalty can excuse almost anything, John's wish to give his son a better life, all of them orbit a single sun that is already burning out. What happens when those illusions can no longer hold? When the campfire stories about honor and rebellion finally collide with the cold facts of industry and power? Every move of the gang's camps traces that collision. From its humble beginnings in the snowy desperation of Coulter to Horseshoe Overlook's fragile normalcy, from the uneasy prosperity of Clemens Point to the rot seeping through Shady Bell and Beaver Hollow, the geography mirrors the moral decay. With each relocation, Dutch compromises a little more, drifts a little further from the idealistic rhetoric that once drew in lost soul after lost soul. His speeches stay grand. His choices grow smaller, meaner, more afraid. At the center stands Arthur Morgan, the man who begins as Dutch's most devoted enforcer and slowly becomes the conscience the gang never asked for. As the noose of civilization tightens, another noose tightens inside him. The realization that the illusion of freedom Dutch sells is not freedom at all, but a cage built from ego, fear, and nostalgia. How many times can a man say, "I have a plan," before those words stop sounding like hope and start sounding like denial? So, this is what the story is really about: the death of the Old West as a viable way to live, the illusion of freedom that masks exploitation and self delusion, the corruption of ideology as Dutch's philosophy curdles under pressure, and, above all, the possibility of redemption in a world that does not forgive. The gang's journey from fragile hope to inevitable tragedy will reveal how that dream collapses, who tries to escape its wreckage, and what Red Dead Redemption 2 was trying to tell all along about the cost of holding on when the world has already moved on. That dream of riding forever into the horizon does not die in a gunfight. It dies the moment the gang reaches St. Denis. From its humble beginnings in snowy Coulter and quiet Horseshoe Overlook, the story has trained the player's senses to love open skies and distant mountains, to read the world by the sound of wind in the trees and hooves on dirt. Then, suddenly, the train doors open on St. Denis and everything's wrong. Smoke hangs in the air, not from campfires but from factories. The soft chorus of birds and crickets is drowned beneath clanging metal, screeching trolleys, and the constant murmur of a crowd that never seems to thin. The streets are choked with carriages, electric lights, and strangers who do not care that an armed outlaw has just stepped into their world. St. Denis is a brick wall made of brick, steel, and money. From the very beginning, Dutch's philosophy depends on the existence of an outside, some untouched wilderness where the gang can outrun the law, regroup, and start again. Here, there is no outside. There is only a web of law, capital, and information that stretches far beyond any one town. Telegraph wires crisscross above the streets. Trains roar in and out, and the Pinkertons move through the city as an extension of banks and railroads, rather than as lone pursuers. How does one escape a civilization that can send a message faster than a horse can ride? For Dutch, this is intolerable. For Arthur, it is revealing. Arthur walks through St. Denis with a mixture of quiet awe and deep unease, studying the crowds, the fashions, the noise. In Missions with Angelo Bronte, he watches Dutch bow and smile for a man who owns half the city, and the discomfort shows in his eyes and in his clipped answers. This world is not impressed by bravado. It does not care about campfire speeches. When Arthur escorts the journalist, when he sees child labor in the factories and hears the arguments over labor and capital, he understands, in the truest sense, that the gang's way of life is not just hunted, it is obsolete. St. Denis becomes the living embodiment of the game's core message. The world was changing and the old ways were dying. The age of the outlaw is not being ended by a faster gun or a braver posse, but by telegraphs that can summon whole agencies, by factories that turn men into replaceable parts, by corporate empires like Cornwall's that can buy law and violence on demand. In that city, Dutch's talk of freedom sounds less idealistic and more delusional, a story of dreams turning into excuses. And when the plan finally crashes against that brick wall in the St. Denis Bank, with Hosea and Lenny dead and Dutch raving about betrayal, the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. The gang is not just losing to enemies, it is losing to time itself. The question is no longer whether they can escape, but who will accept that this world has no place for them, and who will keep riding toward a horizon that no longer exists. That brick wall in St. Denis is not just stone and mortar. It is the moment Dutch finally chooses the myth of himself over the survival of his family, the point where a story of resistance turns into a spectacle of self-destruction. From the very beginning of the St. Denis chapter, the language around the bank job gives it away. Dutch does not talk about safety, or modest scores, or slipping quietly out of a world that no longer wants outlaws. He talks about one last grand score, one last performance that will prove the van der Linde philosophy was right all along. The robbery is framed less as an exit strategy and more as a curtain call, a final attempt to be the living embodiment of freedom in a city built on order, money, and surveillance. Standing opposite him is Hosea, older, tired, and finally ready to accept that the old ways were dying. Hosea pushes for smaller cons, for tickets on a boat, for a future that looks less romantic but far more realistic. Dutch promises a better world. Hosea just wants them to live long enough to see tomorrow. Their conversations in St. Denis are quiet, almost domestic, but under that calm is a fracture between dream and reality, between a man who can adapt and a man who cannot let go. The heist itself exposes that fracture in the truest sense. Dutch chooses the biggest bank in the most modern city they have ever seen, in a place crawling with Pinkertons, telegraphs, and policemen drilled in organized response. The plan is loud, public, theatrical. Mass, dynamite, hostages, a full gang marching into the heart of civilization as if it were still the frontier. It is a move that might have worked from its humble beginnings in some backwater town. In St. Denis, under Cornwall's shadow and Milton's watch, it is practically an invitation, and the world answers. The Pinkertons are not surprised. They are ready. The ambush in the square, Hosea dragged out as an example, his execution turned into a message to every outlaw watching. This is what happens when dreams ignore the calendar. Lenny dies on the rooftops. The gang scatters into the river, and Dutch's legend is paid for with the lives of the two men who believed in him most. After this, his insistence that there was a rat, that the plan was sound, that only betrayal ruined it, stops feeling tragic and starts feeling willful. Because the truth is clear. Dutch was not outsmarted by one informant. He was outgrown by a world he refused to see. Yet instead of shrinking his ambitions, he doubles down, blaming everyone and everything except his own delusions. The bank job is the hinge where leadership turns into obsession, where loyalty becomes a weapon, and where every choice that follows bends toward doom. The question now is not whether Dutch will change, but how many more lives his dream will consume before it finally breaks. Dutch's dream survives the bank, but the gang's soul does not. The hinge swings, the plan limps on, yet the one man who ever made that dream feel grounded in the real world is gone in an instant. From the very beginning, Hosea Matthews carried a different philosophy of crime than Dutch. For Hosea, robbery was survival, not theater. A quiet con, a forged document, a rigged card game in some backroom saloon. These were not grand gestures of rebellion, but ways to slip through the tightening grip of civilization without drawing too much blood. Dutch wanted speeches and shootouts, wanted to be the living embodiment of resistance. Hosea wanted to get in, get out, and go home to a fire, a drink, and a story. That tension between survival and spectacle defines their partnership. Dutch talks about destiny, about a better world just over the next horizon. Hosea talks about getting older, about the old ways we're dying, about knowing when to walk away before the noose finds the neck. One man chases dreams, the other counts bodies. Together, they balance each other. Alone, Dutch is a storm. Arthur feels that balance more than anyone. If Dutch is the preacher, Hosea is the patient teacher. Around the campfire at Horseshoe Overlook on fishing trips with Jack, in those small, easily missed conversations in Valentine roads, Hosea keeps nudging Arthur toward introspection. He asks the quiet questions. What does freedom really mean if it always ends in chains? How much blood can be justified in the name of family? In the truest sense, Hosea is Arthur's father as much as his partner in crime, steering him toward empathy when Dutch pushes him toward obedience. That is what makes St. Denis so cruel. The bank job is Dutch's opera, a show of force in the heart of modern civilization. Hosea walks in knowing it feels wrong, arguing for smaller scores, for a quiet retirement that might finally honor Bessie's memory. Instead, he is dragged into Dutch's last great performance and turned into its opening act. On the public gallows of the city square, surrounded by cameras, policemen, and Pinkertons, Hosea is executed not in a duel or a dusty street, but as a piece of evidence. His death is a symbol as much as a loss. The clever, adaptable outlaw from its humble beginnings is erased by organized, bureaucratic violence. No trick, no disguise, no silver tongue can talk him out of a rifle butt and a bullet. The world was changing, and St. Denis makes that change official. Without Hosea, Dutch's descent accelerates. The one man who could challenge him in good faith, who could call a plan foolish without being branded a traitor, is gone. In the vacuum, Dutch surrounds himself with enablers and provocateurs. Micah whispers flattery and paranoia. Others fall silent, terrified that dissent now means betrayal. Dutch stops hearing questions as concern and starts hearing them as attacks. With Hosea's last lesson unfinished, the gang loses its conscience, and the path ahead narrows toward only one destination. What happens when a dream outlives the only person willing to tell the truth about it? It does not take long for the answer to walk into camp wearing a smirk and a gun belt that never quite sits still. Micah Bell arrives not as a savior, but as a symptom, a reminder that once the conscience is gone, something hungrier always moves in to feed on what remains. If Hosea was the gang's quiet restraint, Micah is the living embodiment of its worst impulses finally given permission. From the very beginning, he stands as Hosea's inverse. Where Hosea scouts, plans, and questions, Micah charges, provokes, and dares the world to shoot first. Hosea talks about retirement, about getting out with enough money to live in peace. Micah talks about big scores and bigger body counts. Hosea sees the gang as a fragile family that must be protected from Dutch's excesses. Micah sees it as a ladder to climb, one corpse at a time. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, Micah is the man who never pretends to care about anything beyond himself. His weapon is not only the revolver on his hip, it is flattery. Micah understands Dutch's ego with a predator's instinct. In campfires and whispered conversations, he feeds Dutch a new philosophy. The problem is not Dutch's plans, the problem is everyone else. Arthur is weak, John is ungrateful, Hosea was too cautious. The world was changing, and only Dutch and Micah are bold enough to meet it with blood and dynamite. Each compliment is a hook. Each suggestion that the others don't believe in you drives the wedge deeper. The irony is cruel. Dutch once prided himself on seeing through civilization's lies, yet he cannot see the lie sitting at his own table. Micah does not believe in freedom or in some better world beyond the horizon. He believes in the cover Dutch's grand speeches provide. When Dutch talks about necessary sacrifice, Micah hears permission. When Dutch reframes failure as noble resistance, Micah hears an excuse to indulge every cruelty and call it a tough choice. Is it any surprise that the St. Denis disaster only makes Micah louder, more indispensable, more dangerous? By Beaver Hollow, the transformation is complete. The old ways were dying, and with Hosea buried and Arthur coughing blood, the gang's ideals are little more than campfire stories. What remains is bare outlaw survival, and in that vacuum, men like Micah rise naturally. He is what the Van der Linde gang becomes when the speeches no longer mean anything. Extortion, torture, senseless violence dressed up as strategy. From its humble beginnings as a ragged family railing against a rigged system, Dutch's caravan ends as a nest of paranoia where the most ruthless voice wins. Micah is not just the parasite of a dying dream. He is the proof of what that dream has decayed into. When a philosophy loses its soul, who gets to inherit its guns? The answer will decide not only the gang's fate, but Arthur's final choice and Dutch's last stand against the truth. And then, just when the gang's dream is collapsing under its own weight, the story is torn out of the West entirely. One moment, the St. Denis streets are full of gunsmoke and sirens. The next, a shipwreck, a storm, and Blackwater swallowing every familiar landmark. Guarma erupts on the horizon not as a new chapter of adventure, but as a fever dream, a reminder that this was never only a local tragedy. From the very beginning of that detour, the world feels wrong. The sky is too bright, the foliage too dense, the colors too saturated, as if civilization's nightmare has been painted over paradise. The gang has spent years railing against railroads, ranchers, and Pinkertons, imagining the American frontier as the entire battlefield. Guarma shatters that illusion. The same story of power and profit repeats itself thousands of miles away, proving that the old ways were dying everywhere, not just in the shadow of Blackwater. On Guarma, the conflict between the plantation owner Alberto Fusar and the rebelling workers is the gang's struggle writ large. A wealthy elite, backed by a private army and complicit officials, uses law, guns, and terror to keep labor cheap and voices silent. It is Cornwall and the Pinkertons, translated into another language, flying another flag. Dutch's anti-establishment philosophy, once pitched as a bold challenge to a rigged system, suddenly looks small against this global machinery. How can one outlaw family topple an empire that treats whole islands as expendable? For Arthur and Dutch, Guarma is a brutal lesson in powerlessness. Their guns are still deadly, their skills still sharp, their courage intact, yet none of it truly matters. They hide in sugar fields, bargain with desperate revolutionaries, and raid forts. But every victory feels temporary, every escape route controlled by someone richer, farther away, and untouchable. In the truest sense, Guarma exposes that the gang was never fighting just sheriffs and bounty posters. It was fighting a world order. Under that tropical sun, Dutch's mask begins to slip for good. Cut off from Hosea's counsel, from the familiar rhythms of camp, he drifts deeper into paranoia. He abandons allies when they become inconvenient, leaves men behind in chaos, and treats human lives as pieces on a board that only he can see. The problem is no longer merely that the world was changing. Dutch himself is changing with it, bending his ideals to match the very cruelty he claimed to resist. Guarma, from its humble beginnings as a shocking detour, becomes the living embodiment of the game's warning. This is not just a story of one doomed gang, but of dreams crushed beneath empires. When the survivors finally glimpse the American coast again, the question hangs over them like storm clouds. If Dutch was capable of this on a distant island, what will he do once his boots touch home soil again? They make it home, but it does not feel like home. When Arthur, Dutch, Javier, and Bill are spat back onto the American shore, it plays less as a triumphant return and more as waking from a fever dream into a world that no longer recognizes them. The mainland should be familiar, a story of forests, towns, and rail lines they once prowled with confidence, yet everything feels off. The gang's camp at Shady Bell is abandoned, the echo of a family that has already scattered. Bedrolls are missing, wagons gone, only scraps of canvas and cold fire pits left behind, as if the very idea of the Von der Linde gang has been uprooted. This disorientation is not just physical. From the very beginning of this chapter, the emotional center has shifted. Hosea is dead. Lenny is dead. The Pinkertons have tightened the noose, and the world was changing while the survivors were trapped on Guarma. What had been a mobile outlaw civilization, messy but coherent, now feels like a rumor. Arthur moves through the ruins of camp and through the streets of St. Denis with the eyes of a man who has outlived his own life. He is home, in the truest sense, and yet he no longer belongs. Guarma functions as a brutal time skip for Dutch's sanity. The Dutch who steps off that boat is the living embodiment of a philosophy gone rancid. On the island, his cruelty could be rationalized as desperation, as the pressure of survival. Back in America, those same impulses reveal how brittle he has become. He hears questions as challenges, concern as betrayal. His speeches grow longer, more frantic, more obsessed with the idea that one last job will buy freedom from a civilization he insists is closing in. The old ways were dying, and instead of adapting, Dutch doubles down on his own legend. The survivors cling to that legend because the alternative is admitting that everything was for nothing. John is missing, Abigail is imprisoned, and yet Dutch's answer is not retreat, but a new plan with the Wapiti, then another with Cornwall, then yet another with the army. Each scheme is sold as the final step, the last push, the score that will fix everything. But who still believes him? Arthur's cough worsens, his doubts sharpen, and even Javier and Bill hesitate, caught between loyalty and the creeping sense that their leader has become a lost soul chasing his own reflection. This return marks the true emotional midpoint of the story. The dream is undeniably broken, but the characters are still pretending it can be patched together, turning every new promise into a ghost. Every move to a new hideout, every whispered, "I have a plan," now feels haunted by Guarma's shadow and Blackwater's failure. The gang is physically back, yet structurally and spiritually, it never really returns from that island. From here on, each decision Dutch makes will not rebuild the family from its humble beginnings. It will accelerate its collapse and drag Arthur toward a final choice that no speech can talk him out of. The island breaks the illusion. Arthur returns from Guarma to a world that looks familiar, yet feels wrong, and the game quietly sets in motion the moment that will make that feeling inescapable. It does not arrive with a gunfight or a grand speech. It arrives with a cough. The seed is planted in a mission that, at first glance, is just another job. Thomas Downs, a desperate farmer in Valentine, owes the gang money. Dutch's philosophy demands repayment. Strauss sends Arthur to collect. From its humble beginnings, this is what the gang has always done: extract survival from other people's misery and call it justice. Arthur threatens a sick man in the mud, grabs his shirt, shoves him, demands the debt. Downs coughs blood into Arthur's face. It feels incidental. It is not. In that moment, the future is written. For a long time, nothing seems to change. The gang moves camps. Dutch chases new dreams. The Pinkertons close in. Yet the body is already telling a different story. Arthur tires faster. His aim wavers. He leans on his horse after a long ride, breathing heavier than before. The first time he doubles over in a fit of coughing, the sound cuts through the noise of gunfire and banter. It is small, but it is wrong. And it will not stop. The diagnosis in St. Denis is the turning point. A nameless doctor, a cramped office, a blunt verdict. Tuberculosis advanced. No miracle cure, no outlaw bravado can change it. In the truest sense, this is the moment the game rips away the fantasy that there is always another score, another plan, another chance to outrun consequence. The world was changing outside, with railroads and oil barons and federal agents. Now, Arthur's own body becomes the living embodiment of that same truth inside him. The old ways were dying, and so was he. From here, every ride at dawn, every campfire conversation, every quiet moment watching the sun bleed over the mountains is reframed. Time has weight now. A simple trip to town feels heavier when the player knows there will not be many more. The question shifts from, how will the gang escape, to, what will Arthur do with what remains? His sickness strips away all excuses. Dutch's promises of some distant land lose their power when the future is a luxury Arthur no longer has. What is freedom when there is no time left to enjoy it? What is loyalty when it means helping a madman chase delusions that will outlive the men who bled for them? A story of loyalty and betrayal becomes, for Arthur, a story of choice. With no real future to chase, Arthur's forced to look backward and inward. The debt to Thomas Downs, the cruelty to Edith and Archie, the years of enforcing Strauss's ledger, all return with brutal clarity. He has been the hand of a system he claimed to hate, crushing poor families while railing against civilization. Now that same hand trembles. In this way, the illness is not just a plot device. It is judgment, not divine, not legal, but personal. It asks Arthur, again and again, what kind of man he wants to be in the time he has left, and whether Dutch's dream is worth one more drop of blood. His answer will decide not only his own redemption, but the path John Marston will be forced to walk next. So his answer does not arrive in a speech or a final blaze of glory, but in small, almost forgettable moments. The great outlaw saga of the Van der Linde gang begins in gunsmoke and grand plans. Arthur's quiet redemption is written in coughs, apologies, and the way he dismounts his horse to help a stranger who has nothing to offer in return. From its humble beginnings, the gang's work had been framed as righteous theft, a story of freedom wrestled from a corrupt civilization. Rob a train, rob a bank, rob the rich. Early on, Arthur is the living embodiment of that philosophy, doing Dutch's bidding with a weary shrug and a quick trigger. But after the diagnosis, something shifts. The same man who once beat Thomas Downs half to death over a debt now rides back to that ruined farm, not to collect, but to give. He hands Edith Downs money he cannot spare, helps her son Archie stand up to a foreman, and in the truest sense tries to repay a wound that can never really be healed. These missions are not grand heists. They are small human choices. Helping the Downs family brings no fortune, no glory, only the bitter knowledge that Arthur's earlier cruelty helped doom them in the first place. Visiting Hamish Sinclair, the one-legged veteran fishing alone by O'Craig's Run, means long rides to the edge of the world for nothing more than a shared hunt, a horse, and a friend. There is no cut of the loot, no Dutch speech at the campfire, only two tired men trading stories of wars that never ended in their heads. In St. Denis, that philosophy deepens. Amid the clatter of trams and the smoke of factories, Arthur meets Sister Calderon, a nun who moves through the city's filth with a serenity he can barely understand. At first, he is awkward, dismissive, another outlaw passing through. Yet as the world was changing and the old ways were dying around him, his posture softens, his eyes drop, his voice grows quieter. By the time he meets her on that bench near the train station, he is no longer boasting. He is confessing. His dialogue in these moments tells a different story than the gang's shootouts. He apologizes. He admits fear. His body language, once broad and threatening, folds inward, shoulders slumped, hands open rather than clenched. He listens to Hamish's regrets, to Edith's anger, to the nun's gentle insistence that it is never too late to try to be better. Who is this man, if not the lost soul Dutch once claimed to rescue, finally rescuing himself? The game invites a slower rhythm here. The player is nudged to ride a little slower to Hamish's cabin, to linger in St. Denis long enough to hear the nun's words, to notice the way Arthur turns his head toward crying children or coughing passersby. These are not mandatory diversions. They are an unspoken question. In a world built on betrayal and broken dreams, what kind of legacy will this man leave? Not in legend, but in the memories of a widow, a soldier, and a nun who saw, for a moment, the man he could have been. And as the gang hurtles toward Beaver Hollow and collapse, those quiet choices begin to matter more than any score, shaping not only Arthur's fate, but the path that waits for John just beyond the horizon. Those quiet choices do not end with Arthur. They echo forward, carried by a man who has been running from responsibility since the very beginning, and who now finds that the world will not let him run forever. John Marston enters this part of the story as a contradiction. He is the gang's prodigal son and its most practical realist, a man who once vanished for months, leaving Abigail and Jack behind, chasing the outlaw dream Dutch sold him from his humble beginnings in the gang. When he returns, torn up by wolves and barely alive, it is not Dutch's philosophy that pulls him back from the brink. It is Abigail's anger, Jack's quiet hurt, and Arthur's grudging concern that force him to confront what kind of man he has been. From that moment, John's arc bends away from glory and toward responsibility. He still robs, still rides, still bleeds for Dutch's plans, but the center of gravity has shifted. Each camp move, from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point to Shady Bell, pushes him closer to the realization that freedom, in the truest sense, is not another score or another country. It is a small house, a patch of land, a life where Jack grows up reading books instead of learning to shoot. Abigail demands it. Jack deserves it. John slowly begins to believe it. Arthur sees this change long before Dutch will admit it. Watching John stumble, then stand, then fight for a future beyond the gun, Arthur recognizes a younger version of himself offered a second chance. Their arguments over responsibility, over leaving, over what family really means, turn into something deeper once Arthur learns he is dying. If his own redemption is a story of acceptance and sacrifice, John becomes the living embodiment of escape, the proof that the cycle does not have to repeat. Dutch, however, cannot allow that proof to stand. His resentment toward John's desire to leave is more than wounded pride over an ungrateful protege. It is fear. If John can walk away from the gang, from the dream, from the man who raised him, then what does that say about Dutch's grand vision of loyalty and civilization? If the son can choose a ranch over revolution, what does that make the father? A leader, or just another lost soul clinging to a fading myth? So Dutch twists John's doubt into betrayal, his love for Abigail and Jack into weakness. He mocks his domestic dreams, questions his courage, and, when the noose tightens at Beaver Hollow, abandons him to the law. The old ways were dying, and Dutch would rather let his family burn than admit the world was changing without him. In this, John becomes more than a character. He becomes a bridge between Arthur's doomed present and the harsher future of Red Dead Redemption, between the gang's collapsing fantasy and the brutal reality that waits on that ranch in West Elizabeth. Every glimpse of John holding Jack, every argument with Abigail about leaving, is a quiet reminder that this story does not end on that mountain. It continues with a man who survives Arthur, but cannot escape his shadow. And as the gang fractures for the last time, a question hangs in the air. Will John truly break free of Dutch's dream, or will that dream come hunting him down on the other side of the law? That question does not hang over John alone. It hangs over the small, tired family that has been dragged from camp to camp, watching the dream of freedom chew through their lives. If Dutch and Arthur are arguing over philosophy and legacy, Abigail Roberts is arguing over boots, blankets, and whether her son will live long enough to become anything more than another name on a wanted poster. From the very beginning, Abigail's role in this story is brutally unromantic. While the gang toasts Dutch's speeches about civilization and the old ways dying, she is packing up bedrolls, chasing Jack through mud, and begging John to stop disappearing for weeks at a time. For Dutch, Blackwater is a disaster. For Abigail, it is one more proof that these men will burn the world before they accept a quiet life. Constant running is not an adventure to her. It is a prison with no walls, only wagons. Her exhaustion is written into every argument. At Horseshoe Overlook, at Clemens Point, at Shady Bell, she repeats the same plea in different words. Stop choosing danger over family. She sees through the rhetoric. Dutch promises that the next score will buy land, that the next move will finally bring stability, yet every move takes Jack farther from schoolhouses, neighbors, and any sense of home. Abigail is not chasing an idealistic dream of outlaw glory. She is counting bullets and years, and both are running out. Jack, meanwhile, inhabits a different world entirely. He is the living embodiment of the gap between the gang's legend and its reality. This boy loves books, not guns. He listens to Hosea's stories, to Arthur's quiet lessons, to tales of pirates and adventurers, and he folds them into a story of his own life that he does not yet understand. When he asks where his father is, the answer is always some version of working, as if robbery and murder were just another trade. To Jack, these men are giants. Uncle is the funny old rogue, Arthur the gruff protector, Dutch the great storyteller by the fire. They are legendary figures in his eyes, heroes who ride off into storms and return with money and tales. To Abigail, though, the same figures are unreliable men, lost soul after lost soul, who keep proving that loyalty to the gang outweighs loyalty to the child sleeping in a damp tent. Red Dead Redemption 2 uses this small family as a mirror held up to the entire Vanderlinde philosophy. Is it noble to die for freedom if that freedom is defined as never settling, never staying, never growing up? Is it heroic to stand against civilization if the cost is a boy who learns that everyone he loves either leaves or dies? In the truest sense, the game is asking whether martyrdom for a dream is still noble when the people left behind only needed presence, not legend. Because for Abigail and Jack, this is not just a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions. It is the bill that Dutch's grand speeches never mention. And John, standing between the campfire myths and his family's quiet desperation, will soon be forced to choose which story survives. John's choice is brewing in the shadows, but at the center of the firelight, another transformation is already underway. Dutch, once the silver-tongued architect of a better world, is becoming something else entirely. Not just a leader, but a prophet desperate to keep his congregation believing as the miracles run dry. From its humble beginnings, the gang had rallied around speeches that felt in the truest sense idealistic. At Horseshoe Overlook or Clemens Point, Dutch spoke of freedom and civilization, of robbing the rich and corrupt so families like theirs could live unshackled. Those early camp speeches were a story of shared purpose, of a philosophy that framed every outlaw act as resistance. The plan was a roadmap then, not a prayer. Doubt could be voiced, argued, even teased, because disagreement still meant belonging. By Beaver Hollow, the cadence is the same, but the content has curdled. Dutch still stands before the gang, still raises his arms to the night, but the subject has shifted from ideals to injuries. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in Dutch's telling that is no longer a tragedy of history, but a personal conspiracy. The Pinkertons, Cornwall, the government, even St. Denis itself become proof that he is persecuted, misunderstood, betrayed. The dream shrinks from a better world for all of us to, they are against me. In that shrinking, dissent is quietly renamed. What began as honest concern becomes doubt, then doubt becomes disloyalty, and disloyalty becomes betrayal. When Hosea questioned a bank job in a modern city, Dutch heard hesitation, not wisdom. When Arthur raises concerns about the Tahiti fantasies or the endless need for one last score, Dutch does not answer. He accuses. After all that I've done? It is emotional blackmail masquerading as leadership. For men and women who have no other family, what is more terrifying? The law outside, or exile from the only campfire that ever took them in? Micah steps into that fear as both echo chamber and executioner. From the very beginning of his time in the gang, he flatters Dutch's ego, praises every reckless move as genius, and turns every setback into evidence that someone inside must be undermining the plan. Where Hosea once tempered Dutch, Micah inflames him. Where Arthur once spoke hard truths, Micah supplies easy enemies. A quiet word from Micah can turn suspicion into a hanging offense, and everyone knows it. Under this pressure, Dutch's paranoia becomes the living embodiment of how charismatic movements decay. When the dream no longer delivers results, a leader can admit failure or demand faith instead of proof. Dutch chooses faith. He repeats, I have a plan, more often as the plans grow worse, insists loyalty is all that matters as his philosophy collapses, and turns a story of freedom into a frightened man's crusade against reality itself. And as his voice rises in Beaver Hollow, another question rises with it. Who will stop following first? The man losing his mind, or the family too afraid to admit the miracle is over? The answer, it turns out, is that it almost does not matter who stops following Dutch first, because something else has already been following them from the very beginning. Not a rival gang, not a vengeful sheriff, but a company with badges. Milton and Edgar Ross arrive in this story not as frothing villains, but as calm professionals. Milton's voice is measured, his posture relaxed, his hat always neatly in place. Ross stands beside him, taking notes, asking polite questions. They speak of terms, of offers, of bringing this all to a close. And then, with that same pleasant detachment, they order gunmen to open fire on a camp full of women and children. The contrast is chilling. Their civility is a mask for a system that kills without raising its voice. These are Pinkertons, and in the truest sense, they are not lawmen at all. They are private agents, hired muscle wearing the costume of civilization, contracted by Leviticus Cornwall and backed by federal authority when convenient. Their badges do not come from the will of a community. They come from a ledger. The line between martial and mercenary blurs, and in that blur, the gang's philosophy crashes into a harder truth. In this world, whoever owns the railroads and the banks owns the law. From its humble beginnings, the Von der Linde gang imagined itself as a story of freedom against a rigged system. Yet every major confrontation with the Pinkertons exposes how small that dream really is. At Horseshoe Overlook, Milton does not demand justice. He offers a deal. Give up Dutch, give up Hosea, and the rest can walk away. In St. Denis, he corners Dutch and Arthur not to argue morality, but to remind them that Cornwall's money, government files, and public opinion are all on his side. Even in Beaver Hollow, when the gang is sick, starving, and fractured, Milton still talks in terms of bargains and leverage, as if human lives were just another asset to be managed. What do these offers reveal? That the Pinkertons are not hunting outlaws to protect innocent townsfolk. They are neutralizing disruptions to investment. Control, not justice. Pacification, not principle. A family is treated as a problem to be solved. A lost soul with a gun becomes a number in a report, and every bullet is written off as a business expense. Through them, the game shows how the world was changing. The old ways were dying, not because a nobler philosophy had won, but because organized, well-funded institutions could simply outlast anyone who stood in the way. Dutch has plans, Arthur has doubts, John has dreams of a quiet ranch, but the Pinkertons have rail schedules, payrolls, and federal backing. And as their noose tightens, another question emerges. When the gun smoke clears, will there be any difference between the men who robbed banks in the mountains and the men who own them in the cities? The answer to that question waits far from St. Denis, in a place that is already living the future the gang fears. Not in a bank or a railroad office, but on a strip of barren land where an entire nation has been pushed to the margins and told to be grateful. The Wapiti Reservation is what happens when the noose finishes tightening. Cramped tents crowd a poisoned river. Sick children lie in the mud while armed soldiers watch from a distance that is not really distance at all. Rations arrive late or never. Medicine is withheld as punishment. It is a camp without freedom, a family without safety, a story of survival reduced to paperwork and fences. Compared to this, the Von der Linde gang's ramshackle camps, with music, firelight, and the illusion of choice, almost seem luxurious. From its humble beginnings in the mountains, the gang has always been on the move, chased by Pinkertons and bad decisions, yet still able to pick up stakes and vanish into the trees. The Wapiti cannot. Their movements are registered, their visitors questioned, their future decided in offices hundreds of miles away. The contrast is brutal. One outlaw family believes it is hunted because it is dangerous. An entire people are caged because their existence inconveniences progress. At the heart of this tragedy stand two men. Rainsfall, the weary chief, is the living embodiment of what generations of broken promises do to idealistic resistance. He negotiates, he pleads, he rides to St. Denis and bows his head to men who barely see him as human. His philosophy has been tempered by betrayal, by treaties signed and then torn apart whenever oil, rail, or profit demanded it. He is not naive, he is exhausted. Eagle flies, burns where his father smolders. Young, proud, desperate, he chooses the gun over the petition, the raid over the meeting. In another world, he might have been a poet or a leader in the truest sense. Here, civilization offers him only the role of rebel or ghost. His rebellion is not born from Dutch's rhetoric, but from centuries of dispossession. How could it end any way but badly? Arthur walks between them and begins to understand. Riding through the reservation, hearing rains fall list the losses, land, bison, language, children, he realizes that what is happening to the gang already happened, on a far greater scale, long before he was born. Dutch speaks as though their tragedy is unique, as though the world was changing just to spite him. The reservation proves otherwise. The old ways were dying long before Dutch ever picked up a pistol. In those missions, the game finally says the quiet part out loud. The outlaw's downfall is not an isolated misfortune. It is part of a pattern. Governments, companies, and private armies crush anything they cannot regulate, tax, or own. Whether it is a native nation on its ancestral land or a caravan of thieves in the woods, the result is the same: pressure, confinement, erasure. The gang's dreams, the Wapiti's homeland, even Arthur's late, fragile hope for redemption, all are ground beneath the same machinery. And as Arthur watches eagle flies die for a war that was lost before he was born, another truth settles in. Dutch has been fighting the wrong enemy with the wrong methods for the wrong reasons. The question is no longer whether the gang can escape, but whether Dutch will ever admit that his grand philosophy was just another story in a world that runs on power, not promises. Eagle Flies steps into the story as if born from the fire Dutch only ever talks about. Young, passionate, and already carrying generations of grief on his shoulders, he is the living embodiment of a people being pushed to the edge while the world was changing around them. To him, the treaties, the courts, the speeches mean nothing, because every promise his father was given has already been broken. From the very beginning, Eagle Flies reads the language of civilization as violence. Railroads cut through hunting grounds, oil rigs poison rivers, soldiers march where children once played. In that world, what else could resistance look like but guns and dynamite? His anger is not a flaw in his character. It is a rational response to a system that only seems to listen when blood is spilled. The tragedy is that he is right about the problem and doomed by the solution. Dutch sees that fury and recognizes it instantly, not as a warning, but as an opportunity. The same way he once looked at Arthur, a lost soul who could be molded into an instrument of his philosophy, he now looks at Eagle Flies and sees a chance for one last grand stand. He speaks of freedom, of shared enemies, of a story of oppressed peoples striking back against the machine. But beneath the rhetoric, he is doing what he has always done, using someone else's pain to justify his own need for a glorious, violent gesture. The raids that follow feel heroic in the moment. The factory assault, the train ambush, the desperate charges against fortified positions. They are staged as classic Western heroics, brave men riding hard against impossible odds. Yet each time, entrenched military power answers with discipline, artillery, and endless reinforcements. What chance does a handful of warriors and outlaws have against a government that can replace every fallen soldier and bury every scandal? Courage crashes against bureaucracy and vanishes. Here, the old ways were dying in the truest sense. Not just for Dutch's gang, but for Eagle Fly's entire nation. His bravery cannot move politicians who never see the battlefield, nor can his sacrifice touch the corporate men who will profit from the land once his people are gone. The raids win moments, never ground. They create legends, not safety. When Eagle Flies falls, bleeding in Arthur's arms after the final assault, the cost of Dutch's delusions becomes impossible to ignore. This is more than another failed plan, more than another camp on the move. For Arthur, it is the moment Dutch's mask finally breaks. A young man who had everything to lose and almost nothing to gain has been fed into the fire so Dutch can keep believing he is still the hero of his own story. If Dutch can sacrifice Eagle Flies so easily, who is truly safe in this outlaw family? And if this is where Dutch's grand philosophy leads, what does that say about the man leading them toward the next disaster? Eagle Flies is not the last sacrifice. He is simply the moment when Arthur finally sees the cost. From that point on, every conversation with Dutch stops being an argument about plans and becomes a quiet trial about the man himself. The fractures appear first around John. In St. Denis and after Guarma, Arthur challenges Dutch over and over. John has a family. John has done his time. John deserves to walk away. Dutch's response is not reasoned leadership, but wounded pride. He calls John ungrateful, questions his loyalty, insists that the gang comes before one man's freedom. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is suddenly reduced to one simple test. Will Dutch let his surrogate son go, or will he keep him in chains made of debt and guilt? When the gang reaches Beaver Hollow, that answer becomes clear. Dutch leaves John for dead on the train job, then snarls when Arthur dares to bring it up. The very beginning of Arthur's faith had been Dutch rescuing him as a boy. Now Dutch is the one doing the abandoning. Every time Arthur raises his voice, Dutch deflects, changes the subject, or turns his fury on the question itself. The problem is never the plan. The problem, in Dutch's mind, is anyone who doubts the plan. The Wapiti tragedy deepens the rift. Arthur, sick, exhausted, and finally seeing the world as it really is, questions the wisdom of dragging a starving nation into Dutch's private war. Dutch answers with grand speeches about civilization and oppression, but the philosophy has hollowed out. He promises the Wapiti a better world, then walks them straight into massacre. When Arthur confronts him, Dutch hides behind abstractions, behind Cornwall, behind the Pinkertons, never behind his own choices. The game begins to stage missions as moral crossroads in the truest sense. In dialogue, in small gestures, Arthur can either echo Dutch's paranoia or quietly push back. He can cover for John or expose him, indulge Micah's cruelty or restrain it, chase one more doomed score or urge retreat. Each choice does more than adjust honor. It draws a line between enabling a lost soul and resisting the living embodiment of the gang's decay. The old ways were dying, but Dutch refuses to admit it, so he keeps dragging everyone toward a future that no longer exists. Micah becomes the catalyst and the excuse. Dutch defends him obsessively, praises his loyalty, and snaps at Arthur for questioning this new favorite. Two men who once would have robbed each other on sight now stand together as the most dangerous pair in camp. Arthur's protests are met with cold stares from Javier, with silence from Bill, with fearful glances from Tilly and Mary Beth. The family is still there, but the center is gone. Visually, Arthur drifts to the margins. He smokes alone on rocks above Beaver Hollow. He rides with Charles and Sadie, the ones already halfway out the door. Around the campfire, the laughter sounds thinner, the circle smaller, the shadows longer. Dutch, by contrast, is often framed above or apart, addressing the gang from a ledge, pacing on a ridge, silhouetted against a dying sky. Again and again, Arthur watches him from a distance. In the chaos of ambushes, in the uneasy quiet of camp, on that high ground where Dutch surveys a kingdom that no longer exists, Arthur finally understands. The man he once trusted is now the greatest threat to everyone he still cares about. The question is no longer whether Dutch has a plan. The question is how far Arthur is willing to go to stop it, and what that will cost when the guns finally come out on the ridge. On that ridge, Arthur finally sees Dutch as the greatest danger to his own family. But even as he turns against the man, another truth has already closed in around them. Dutch is not the only hunter. From the very beginning, something larger has been stalking the gang. That something is given a name and a badge, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Not just lawmen, but hired corporate muscle, brought in by railroads, banks, and oil barons to turn justice into a service that can be bought. In the truest sense, the Pinkertons are where law, money, and emerging industrial power fuse into a single weapon, pointed straight at anyone who dares to live outside the new order of civilization. The story makes this clear long before St. Denis. In Valentine, in Rhodes, at Colm O'Driscoll's hanging, their agents appear at the edges of the frame, watching, cataloging, tightening the noose. Milton and Ross do not rant or rave. They file reports. They gather evidence. They wait. Each camp move, from its humble beginnings at Coulter to Horseshoe Overlook, from Clemens Point to Shady Bell, and finally Beaver Hollow, feels less like escape and more like retreat under surveillance. Their presence turns the gang's journey into a story of a net drawing closed. The failed Blackwater ferry robbery is not an isolated disaster. It is a contract signed in blood with men who answer to ledgers, not sheriffs. Every score Dutch chases to prove his philosophy, every risk he takes to reclaim freedom, only makes the Pinkertons' case stronger. The world was changing, and with it the tools of control: telegraphs, rail lines, corporate records, federal warrants. Outlaws moved through mud and snow. The machine moves through paper and wires. Against that machine, the Van der Linde gang is messy, contradictory, painfully human. They argue over dinner. They grieve, drink, and dream. Hosea wants small, quiet scores in a cottage somewhere. Arthur sketches in his journal and wonders what kind of man he has become. Even Dutch, drowning in delusions, still speaks the language of loyalty and betrayal, of personal grudges and personal glory. Their violence is intimate. It has faces, names, reasons, however flawed. The Pinkertons are the opposite: cold professionalism, Coordinated raids, calm offers of amnesty and prison terms, delivered without hatred, almost without emotion. When Milton corners Arthur on the docks of St. Denis, he does not speak as a villain in a melodrama. He speaks as an employee executing a contract. Is there any real difference in his mind between hunting this gang and breaking a strike? By giving the invisible machine human faces, the game sharpens its critique. Milton and Ross are not portrayed as cackling monsters. They are competent, even understandable within their world. That is the point. The true antagonist is the system that needs men like them, that rewards their efficiency, that calls their relentless pursuit of a dying outlaw dream progress. When Milton dies and Ross lives on to hound John, the message is clear. Remove one agent, and another will take his place. The old ways were dying, and the machine would endure. The gang can fight Column, shoot O'Driscolls, even turn on Micah. But how do outlaws shoot a railroad? How do they ambush a bank charter or a government file? That question hangs over every ambush and every desperate ride, setting the stage for the final, brutal realization of what redemption can and cannot change. The answer to that question rides into the story with a badge, a ledger, and a quiet smile. If Cornwall is the money and the railroads are the veins, Milton and Ross are the hands that make the machine move, the living embodiment of a new order that no amount of gunfire can scare. From the very beginning, Milton's presence feels different from the rough lawmen and bounty hunters the gang has dealt with for years. In his interrogation of Arthur and Valentine, there is no sermon about right and wrong, no pretense of moral outrage. Milton lays it out plainly. Work for the government, betray Dutch and live a little longer, or stay loyal and die when the state decides the time is convenient. Justice is not even part of the conversation. Control is. That same cold clarity defines his confrontation with Abigail in St. Denis. He does not accuse her of sin or corruption. He presents her with a transaction. Her family's freedom in exchange for information, her silence in exchange for John's suffering. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, stripped of romance and reduced to paperwork. In the truest sense, Milton shows that for this new civilization, people are just leverage on a page. Ross stands beside him, already wearing that smug detachment that will define his role in Red Dead Redemption. Where Milton presses, Ross observes. Where Milton threatens, Ross smirks. To him, Arthur is not a monster or a hero, just another outlaw to be catalogued, cornered, and eventually discarded. His calm amusement in these scenes quietly foreshadows John's fate years later, reminding the audience that the government's memory is long, and its patience even longer. Their power is not in their pistols. It is in their information. They always seem to know where the gang will be next. Coulter's Trail, Horseshoes Ridges, the swamps around Shady Bell, the darkness of Beaver Hollow. Telegraph lines, train schedules, informants, and files replace the old reliance on rumor and luck. The wilderness that once protected Dutch's family now betrays them, mapped, measured, and reported back to men who read the world through ledgers instead of landscapes. How can an outlaw outrun a system that already knows the road ahead? Visually and thematically, Milton and Ross are the mirror image of Dutch. Dutch paces, rants, improvises one more plan, then another, then another. Milton walks into campfires and city streets with quiet certainty, as if the outcome is already written. Dutch clings to the fantasy that from its humble beginnings, his gang can still buy freedom with one last score. Milton and Ross know the truth. The old ways were dying, and the era of outlaws is already over. All that remains is to show Dutch, Arthur, and John how that story ends, because the story is already bigger than them. From the very beginning of 1899, the real conflict is not gang versus lawmen, but capital versus a dying frontier, with the Vanderlinde gang caught in the crossfire as expendable debris. Leviticus Cornwall is the clearest signal of that shift. He is not a gunslinger, not a sheriff, not an outlaw. He is the living embodiment of a new kind of power, a railroad magnate with his own private army, telegraph lines, oil fields, and politicians on retainer. When his trains are robbed, when his safes are cracked, he does not duel Dutch in the street. He buys the Pinkertons, in the truest sense, turning what was once a detective agency into a corporate militia in government clothing. Every time the gang hits a train, an oil wagon, or a factory payroll, it is not a random score. It is a direct collision with the economic forces that are stitching the continent together in iron and wire. The train in the snow, the armored coach in the heartlands, the refinery at the Cornwall kerosene and tar plant in Annesburg. Each job is another insult to a man whose empire is being woven into the fabric of the state itself. The world was changing, and Dutch's philosophy of robbery as rebellion is suddenly interfering with timetables, stock prices, and congressional deals. That is why Milton has leverage. His badge is less important than his contract. The Pinkertons do not simply enforce the law, they enforce progress, guarding railroads, breaking strikes, and dragging anyone who stands in the way into the mud. When Milton and Ross arrive in St. Denis, they walk straight into Mayor Lemieux's parties and Angelo Bronte's mansion, moving through salons where businessmen, lawmen, and politicians trade favors over champagne. Law and profit share the same table, the same cigars, the same contempt for people who still believe freedom can be found in the open country. The game shows this quietly, almost casually. A speech from a governor about modernization echoes over a city where children work in factories. A banker in St. Denis funds both respectable projects and shady investments. Cornwall stands beside officials during public ceremonies, then orders killings in private. Where does public duty end and private profit begin? In this world, the line has already blurred into smoke from factory chimneys. Against that backdrop, the van der Linde gang is not a legendary threat. It is an inconvenience, a delay on the line, a cost on a balance sheet that can be reduced with enough hired guns and legal documents. Dutch believes he is waging a grand war against civilization, a story of freedom and resistance written in dynamite and blood. To Cornwall, to Milton, to the men in suits, he is a rounding error. That is the tragedy. These outlaws think they are the main characters in a story that has already moved on without them, chasing dreams that were obsolete before the Blackwater ferry ever burned. And the more Dutch refuses to see that, the more brutal the collision between his fading world and the new order becomes. Guarma is where that collision stops being metaphor and becomes a fever dream. One moment, the gang is fleeing St. Denis by boat, still pretending the next score will fix everything. The next, they are shipwrecked on the edge of the world, washed up on a tropical shore that feels unreal, hallucinatory, and yet brutally honest. From its humble beginnings as a simple detour, Guarma becomes a concentrated vision of the forces that have been closing in since the very beginning. The sugar plantations that dominate the island are the living embodiment of industrial exploitation, stripped of the polite language of progress and civilization. Here, there are no speeches about opportunity, no illusions of freedom. There are chained laborers, armed guards, and smokestacks rising over fields where men collapse under the sun. The cruelty on Alberto Fusar's estates mirrors what Cornwall is doing back in America, only without the veneer. Where the railroads and oil wells in the West hide their brutality behind contracts and company towns, Guarma shows the same philosophy in the truest sense. Extract, consume, discard. The old ways were dying, but not because a nobler world was replacing them. They were being strangled so the same handful of names could profit from every acre, every body, every drop of sugar and oil. In this world, Dutch and his outlaws barely register. On Guarma, the van der Linde gang is no longer the center of the story, not even in their own minds. They are reduced to hired guns in someone else's revolution, mercenaries drifting through a conflict that began long before they arrived and will continue long after they're gone. They rescue Javier, they aid Hercule and the rebels, they topple a fortress, but nothing truly belongs to them here. That sudden irrelevance is not an accident. It echoes their fading importance back home, where Pinkertons, railroads, and industrialists have already decided the future. Dutch talks about leading the people, about fighting civilization, but on Guarma, he is following orders, running missions for men who barely know his name. What does freedom mean when the grand outlaw philosopher is just another gun for hire? Look closer at the crates, the ledgers, the whispers in the background, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. The same corporate interests that stalk the gang in America quietly appear in Guarma's docks and warehouses. Familiar company stamps, shared investors, the same financial web binding a Caribbean island to a Blackwater ferry, and a St. Denis bank. Local suffering, global profit. Guarma is the game pulling back the curtain. It reveals that the story of the van der Linde gang is not just a regional tragedy about a dying frontier, but a fragment of a worldwide pattern of conquest and extraction. The world was changing, and the island shows how far those changes already reach. The question is not whether Dutch can escape this system. The question is whether he can even admit it exists before it swallows him whole. And when he returns from Guarma, something in him has shifted, though not in the way Arthur hopes. He comes back to America, but he does not come home. The ship lands, the gang staggers off the dock, and on the surface it seems as if the story has simply resumed where it left off. The same faces, the same weapons, the same outlaw campfire waiting somewhere in the woods. But something essential has been burned away. From its humble beginnings in the snow at Coulter to the lazy afternoons at Clemens Point, the camps once felt alive. There was music and bad singing, poker games and shared bottles, Abigail scolding John while Uncle slept through his chores. The rituals mattered. Pearson's stew pot, Hosea's quiet jokes, the way everyone gathered when Dutch spoke about freedom and the gang as family. The camp was not just a hideout, it was, in the truest sense, a home built against a hostile world. After Guarma, that home returns as a shadow. Beaver Hollow is damp, cramped, and half feral, a cave in the mud rather than a village in the trees. Conversations grow shorter, more guarded. Bill and Javier mutter instead of boast. Tilly and Mary Beth stop daydreaming and start watching the tree line. Even the music dies. The guitars are still there, but the songs barely come. The warmth that once defined the gang's life has been replaced by a low, constant hum of fear. At the center of that chill stands Dutch. The man who once quoted philosophy and poetry now quotes only himself. He speaks in slogans, in half-remembered fragments of his old speeches, as if repeating them will make them true again. He is more violent, quicker to reach for the gun than the word. Cornwall's death, the massacre at the oil fields, the cold decision to leave people behind. Each new act feels less strategic and more desperate. The living embodiment of an idealistic rebellion has become a man who can barely explain his own rage. His fixation on Micah completes the transformation. Where once Hosea's caution balanced Dutch's dreams, Micah now feeds his paranoia, whispering about traitors and weakness. Dutch becomes secretive, slipping off with Micah, hiding plans, demanding loyalty but withholding trust. It is as if Guarma took the last of his doubt and mercy and left a hollow shell that needs constant flattery to keep standing. A leader who once inspired faith now demands obedience. For Arthur, and for the player moving through his eyes, the disorientation is profound. The map is familiar. Valentine still smells of mud and whiskey. Rhodes still hides its rotten core behind whitewashed porches. But the emotional landscape has changed beyond recognition. The same roads lead to different destinations. The same campfires no longer offer safety. What does it mean to go back when everything that made a place feel safe has died? This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, turning in on themselves. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the gang's return from Guarma marks the moment the fantasy can no longer keep up. The game is quietly insisting on a hard truth. A man can ride the same trail, pitch his tent in the same clearing, hear the same river at night, and still never truly return to the very beginning. Home, in this world, is not a place that waits. It is something fragile that exists only as long as the people within it believe the same story. Once that story breaks, the camp is just canvas and wood, and every returning outlaw is, in the end, a lost soul passing through. But some people in that camp were no longer content to be passing through. They wanted a destination. And no one embodied that tension more than John, Abigail, and the small boy who turned the gang's grand philosophy into a painfully simple question. Where is Jack going to grow up? From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had sold itself as a family, a story of freedom and loyalty that could outlast the world closing in. Dutch called Arthur and John his boys. He promised a better world, a place across the river, across the sea, beyond civilization. Yet the moment John tried to make that promise concrete, to leave, to find land, to build a home, Dutch's affection curdled into resentment. It was not just that John had disappeared after Blackwater, it was that his return, and his wish to walk away, exposed the lie that the gang itself was a future. If this was truly a family, why did leaving feel like betrayal instead of graduation? Dutch could forgive murder, robbery, even Micah's constant needling, but he could not forgive the implication that his dream was temporary. John's desire to settle, to earn money and then step away, said out loud what Dutch could not bear to hear. The old ways were dying, and the campfire was not a permanent home. In the truest sense, John was not abandoning the gang. He was trying to grow beyond it. Abigail cut through the rhetoric even more brutally. Where Dutch spoke of ideals, of chains and tyrants and a living embodiment of resistance, she spoke of bacon, boots, and bullets. She asked about food on the table, about a roof that would not be burned down by Pinkertons, about Jack reading books instead of learning to shoot. Her language was not poetry, but inventory. In a world where men debated freedom and philosophy, she became the voice of simple survival, demanding that this supposed family act like one. Arthur found himself caught between those two worlds. Raised on Dutch's speeches, he had been the model outlaw son, ready to bleed for the cause, to ride into St. Denis or Rhodes without question. Yet, as the gang fled from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point to Shady Bell, As Jack was kidnapped and Hosea urged smaller scores and quiet retirement, Arthur began to see a different kind of courage in John. Wanting to live, to raise a child away from gunfire, was not cowardice. It was a new definition of manhood that did not end with a bullet. That sympathy marked a turning point. Each time Dutch mocked John's plans or dismissed Abigail as hysterical, Arthur's silence grew heavier. He started helping John behind Dutch's back, nudging him toward that ranch, that imagined future. It was a quiet rebellion against the masculine ideal of dying for the gang's dreams and delusions. The reaction from the camp revealed something uglier. John's attempt to leave was treated not as a milestone, but as treason. He was guilted, shamed, pulled back into robberies for the family. This was not just an outlaw gang anymore. It was an abusive system, a closing fist that punished anyone who dared to open the door. How many real families, how many failing institutions operate on that same unspoken rule? Devotion is measured not by love, but by how much of a dying dream someone is willing to sacrifice their life for. In that sense, John's struggle became a microcosm of the entire von der Linde story. A man trying to walk toward the future, dragged backward by people who claimed to love him, led by a leader who would rather see his children die at his side than live without his name. And as the noose tightened and the world was changing faster than Dutch could talk, that conflict between staying and leaving would decide who made it out of the woods at all, and who would be buried beneath the trees. That conflict finally stops being theoretical the moment Arthur's body betrays him. The story of a gang running from civilization becomes, in an instant, the story of a man who cannot outrun his own lungs. It happens in a doctor's office in St. Denis, far from the mountains and campfires where Dutch spun tales of freedom and destiny. The scene is quiet, too quiet for an outlaw used to gunfire and galloping hooves. The doctor's words are clinical, almost bored, but the sound design does the real talking. The world narrows. Ambient city noise falls away. The score thins to a low, uneasy hum, and Arthur's breathing suddenly feels too loud in the mix. The camera lingers on his face as the diagnosis lands. Tuberculosis. No dramatic outburst, no shattered furniture, just a man staring into a future that has been quietly stolen while he was busy chasing someone else's dream. From the very beginning, the seeds of this moment were already in the ground. The disease is not a random tragedy dropped from the sky. It is the living embodiment of consequence. Early in the game, Arthur is sent to collect from Thomas Downs, a sick, desperate farmer coughing blood into a handkerchief. Dutch's philosophy demands payment, and Arthur, still loyal, still hardened, beats a dying man in the mud. That scene passes quickly, almost routinely. Months later, the diagnosis reveals what it truly was. Not just cruelty, but a contagion, a debt collected with interest, a man's life traded for a stranger's illness. After that, the illness is not confined to cutscenes. It moves into every frame, every system. Coughing fits wrench Arthur out of conversations and gunfights, turning moments of swagger into moments of weakness. His vision blurs at the edges, the color drains, the world itself seems to fade as his stamina and health decline. Long rides that once felt effortless now come with a quiet dread. Every hill is steeper, every sprint shorter, every brawl a reminder that the old ways were dying inside his own chest. How long can an outlaw outrun the law when he cannot even outrun a staircase? In the truest sense, Arthur's failing body becomes the game's harshest narrator. Dutch's speeches still promise one last score, one last ride, one last miracle. But Arthur's lungs refuse to cooperate. The gap between Dutch's dreams and Arthur's reality widens with every cough. That gap forces questions no sermon at camp could ever fully silence. What matters when the horizon is no longer infinite? What is loyalty worth when the cost is the last months of a stolen life? And if time is a debt that must be paid, who deserves what little he has left to give? From its humble beginnings as a roaming outlaw family, this was always a story of borrowed time. Arthur's illness simply removes the illusion of abundance. It pushes him toward the only form of freedom still available, choosing how to spend the end. That reckoning with time, with consequence, will shape every decision that follows, and it will decide who remains a lost soul and who finds a measure of peace before the curtain finally falls. That ticking clock does not just change Arthur's fate, it quietly rewrites the entire world around him. Suddenly, every detour, every stranger by the roadside, every name in his ledger stops being a distraction from the main story and becomes the main story, a story of what a dying outlaw does with the last scraps of his soul. The Downs family is the first mirror held up to that soul. From the very beginning, Thomas Downes is introduced as a man harassed by the gang's debt, coughing blood in the mud while Arthur stands over him as Dutch's enforcer. Later, when Arthur learns that the same disease is eating him from the inside, visiting Edith and her son Archie is no longer just an optional errand. It is an act of penance. The same boots that once kicked a sick man now walk back to offer money, protection, and a clumsy apology. In those quiet scenes, the old ways were dying in the truest sense, and Arthur knows he helped kill them. Hamish Sinclair offers a different reflection. A one-legged veteran living alone by a lake. He is the living embodiment of a country that chewed men up and left them behind. Their fishing trips and hunting rides are almost comically small compared to bank robberies and shootouts, yet they carry more weight. Two men, both scarred by a nation's violence, trading stories about horses and war while pretending not to notice how lonely they are. When Hamish dies and Arthur inherits his horse, it feels less like a reward and more like an inheritance of regret, a reminder that loyalty often comes too late. Then there is the nun in St. Denis, Sister Calderon, who meets Arthur in the filth of the city and somehow sees through the dirt and blood. On the bench outside the station, as trains scream past and civilization roars forward, she asks him what he believes his life has amounted to. Arthur, who once laughed at Dutch's philosophy while still following it, finally admits his fear and his shame. Her gentle insistence that it is never too late to do good turns a simple conversation into a confession. Who is Arthur Morgan, if not the sum of what he chooses now? His journal answers that question on every page. From its humble beginnings as a sketchbook of robberies, faces, and half-amused observations, it slowly becomes a ledger of failure and longing. The drawings of Dutch and Hosea grow more haunted, the commentary less detached. He writes about Dutch's betrayals, Hosea's warnings, John's struggle to choose family over freedom. The ink itself becomes a record of a man peeling away Dutch's delusions and confronting his own. Even the honor system shifts, almost imperceptibly, from a game mechanic to an internal balance sheet. A decision to help a stranger, to spare an enemy, to return a stolen wagon, no longer feels optional. Each choice is another entry in a moral ledger that only Arthur can see. High honor or low honor stops being about rewards and unlocks and becomes a verdict on who this man is when no one is watching. In this stretch of the story, the grand heists and bloody set pieces recede, and a different kind of climax takes shape. The true heart of Red Dead Redemption 2 is not found in the loudest gunfight, but in the quiet moments where Arthur stands at a crossroads and chooses. Between loyalty and truth, between family and fantasy, between dying as Dutch's blunt instrument or as something approaching a decent man. Those small human decisions will echo into John's future and into the final, brutal unraveling of the gang's dream. Those crossroads are where the game quietly rewrites what strength even means. For all the noise and gunsmoke, Red Dead Redemption 2 is, in the truest sense, a story of two models of manhood colliding, Dutch's theatrical bravado and Arthur's late, halting humility. From the very beginning, Dutch's masculinity is a performance. He stands on crates, on rocks, on barroom tables, turning every camp meeting into a sermon about freedom and civilization, about loyalty and betrayal. His big speeches after Blackwater, after Rhodes, after St. Denis are not just rallying cries. They are shields. If he keeps talking about destiny and philosophy, he never has to say the simple words that terrify him most. I was wrong. Fear, doubt, responsibility, those are weaknesses in Dutch's world, things to be buried under another plan. Watch how he uses volume to drown out vulnerability. When Hosea questions him, Dutch talks over him. When Arthur raises concerns, Dutch pivots to grand ideas, to the world was changing, to the old ways were dying. When the gang starves at Coulter or rots in Beaver Hollow, he does not admit he is lost. He declares that they are the living embodiment of resistance. It is not courage, it is hiding in plain sight. Arthur spends most of his life mistaking that noise for strength. His early answer to every problem is a gun, a threat, a clenched jaw. Yet as his body fails and his illusions crack, his most powerful moments become almost whisper quiet. He apologizes to John on the mountain, finally admitting he was jealous, that he held John back. He kneels in the mud with Reverend Swanson and confesses his own failings instead of mocking another broken man. He returns to Downes's widow and son, not to collect, but to say he is sorry for what he did, and to try, too late, to make it right. These are acts the old Arthur would have called weakness. They are, in truth, his greatest feats. No gunfight in St. Denis carries the weight of Arthur sitting with a dying Edith Downes in Ansburg, or quietly telling Mary Beth to go find a different life. In those scenes, the outlaw who once saw people as marks or muscle begins to see them as something else. Individuals with their own futures, not props in Dutch's story. That shift is clearest with women and children. Protecting Jack is no longer just guarding the gang's mascot. It is making sure a boy escapes the fate of every lost soul in Beaver Hollow. Listening to Abigail, to Sadie, to Mary, Arthur finally hears that their dreams do not match Dutch's delusions. He helps them leave, even when it means tearing at the last threads of his own family. Through that contrast, the game's thesis emerges. Real strength is not dying loudly for a doomed idea. It is living, and if living is no longer possible, then dying in a way that opens a door for others. Dutch clings to a fantasy of freedom and drags everyone down with him. Arthur, at the end, lets go, and that choice will carry John into the next, harsher chapter of this world's story. Arthur's death clears the stage. Dutch's dream is bleeding out on that mountain, and into the silence steps the one man who never believed in it in the first place. This is where Micah Bell stops circling the campfire and starts pretending to own it. From the very beginning, Micah is an outsider among outlaws, a drifter who joins late, talks loud, and listens little. At Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, he hovers at the edges, needling Arthur, provoking fights, volunteering for the dirtiest work. Dutch keeps him close enough to use, but not close enough to trust. Hosea watches him with the wary eyes of a man who has seen this story of ambition and betrayal before, and senses exactly what kind of fire Dutch is playing with. Hosea's death in St. Denis changes everything. The gang loses its conscience, and Dutch loses the only voice willing to say no to his grandest delusions. Into that vacuum flows Micah's poison. He flatters Dutch relentlessly, calling him the man with the plan, encouraging every wild scheme, every leap without a landing. Where Hosea once argued for small scores and quiet exits, Micah pushes for spectacle. The bank heist, the assault on Bronte, the doomed alliance with the Cuban revolutionary in Guarma. Look at the missions that follow. Micah urges Dutch to massacre the O'Driscolls instead of listening to Cullum's offer. He insists on storming Cornwall's train and oil interests, dragging the gang deeper into the crosshairs of civilization's new powers. At Beaver Hollow, he is the loudest advocate for more violence and less planning, for robbing the army, for burning bridges with the native allies Dutch claims to respect. Dutch listens, not because Micah is wise, but because Micah never questions him. Ego prefers praise over truth. The rest of the gang feels the shift. Arthur's suspicion hardens into certainty. Charles, Sadie, and even Javier sense that Micah is trouble, that his presence means the family they built from its humble beginnings is becoming something uglier. Conversations in camp grow tense. Glances linger. Some are afraid of Micah, some are tired, most are resigned. Their reactions become the living embodiment of how sick the group has become. When a parasite can speak louder than the healer, what does that say about the body it feeds on? Micah, in the truest sense, is not a mastermind. He is a symptom. He is what appears when the world is changing, when the old ways were dying, and a once idealistic philosophy has rotted into paranoia and self-worship. Men like him thrive in collapsing systems, where loyalty is measured in flattery and brutality is mistaken for strength. Dutch does not simply fall. He chooses the man who will help him hit the ground harder, and when the dust settles, who is left standing beside him on that cliff, and who is left buried beneath their dream of freedom? In the end, it is not the bullets that break the Von der Linde gang first. It is the question that begins to haunt every campfire and every whispered conversation. Who is talking to the Pinkertons? From the very beginning of the Blackwater disaster, the pattern is there, faint at first, then undeniable. Every time Dutch promises a clean escape, the law is already waiting. The ferry, the bank in St. Denis, the ambushes in the swamps and on the roads. Each failure tightens the noose around their necks, but it also tightens something else, the paranoia coiling in Dutch's mind. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in his eyes that could only happen if someone inside was betraying the dream. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, suspicion is an undercurrent. By Shady Bell and Beaver Hollow, it becomes the main current, dragging everyone downstream. Dutch starts talking about rats and snakes, about loyalty and betrayal, about how civilization will always try to break a man who dares to be free. The irony is brutal. A gang that once prided itself on being a story of freedom and family now spends its days watching one another's eyes instead of the horizon. Red flags surround Micah from the moment he slithers into their world, freshly freed from jail, already whispering about bigger scores and bloodier answers. He disappears at convenient times, returns with convenient information, pushes Dutch toward Cornwall, toward the bank, toward chaos. Yet Dutch refuses to see him as the problem. Why? Because Micah is the living embodiment of what Dutch needs most at this stage, someone who still believes, loudly and violently, in the myth of Dutch van der Linde. It is not loyalty, it is flattery weaponized. A man who has lost Hosea, who is losing Arthur, clings to the one voice still telling him he is right. So the accusations fall on others. Molly, drunk and desperate, claims she betrayed the St. Denis job, and Grimshaw executes her in the mud before the truth can even be questioned. Suspicion circles around Abigail, around John, around anyone who dares to talk about leaving. Even Arthur, who once enforced Dutch's code, finds himself treated as a potential traitor the moment he challenges the philosophy behind one more score. Camp, once a noisy refuge of shared meals, bad jokes, and quiet moments of tenderness, turns into a maze of side glances and half-finished sentences. By the time it is finally revealed that Micah is the Pinkerton informant, the revelation almost feels hollow. The damage is already done. The gang has been living under the shadow of an invisible knife for too long, cutting one another long before the law can finish the job. In the truest sense, the family is dead before the last gunfight. What remains is only a group of outlaws bound together by fear, ego, and habit, chasing dreams that have already bled out in the dirt. And when that truth finally surfaces, the question is no longer who betrayed the gang, but was there anything left to save it all? The answer arrives in the place that once felt safest. The proof is written not in blood on the street, but in ashes around the fire. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde camp had been presented as a refuge. Wagons in a circle, coffee on the boil, children running between tents while adults played cards and argued about philosophy. Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point were the living embodiment of Dutch's promise that an outlaw world could still feel like home. There was music at night, chores in the morning, and a fragile sense that freedom and family could coexist, at least for a while. By the end, that illusion has rotted. Coulter, up in the mountains after Blackwater, is the first crack. Snow howling, men shivering, voices low and tired. It is a camp in name only, a triage station for a wounded dream. But the real descent comes later, in the swamps and caves. Shady Bell is damp, infested, haunted by the remnants of another lost war. Beaver Hollow is worse. Tents sag in the mud, smoke hangs heavy, and every conversation sounds exhausted, as if the very beginning of each sentence is already apologizing for what comes next. The daily rituals that once defined the gang begin to vanish. Card games, once rowdy and teasing, turn quiet, suspicious, or stop altogether. The sing-alongs and fiddle tunes that used to echo through the trees now appear only as strained performances, with Karen drunk, Javier distant, and even Uncle's lazy jokes falling flat. Chores are done in silence, or not done at all. The camp that once told a story of shared labor and shared reward now feels like a stage where everyone knows the play is over but keeps mouthing their lines. Who are they trying to convince, each other or themselves? In this suffocating atmosphere, the confrontations that follow feel inevitable. Arguments no longer end with Dutch's booming reassurance or Hosea's quiet mediation. They end with hands hovering near gun belts. When Arthur challenges Dutch at Beaver Hollow, when John tries to leave, when Micah fans the flames, the campfire becomes a front line. Guns are drawn in the same clearing where there used to be shared meals and birthday toasts. The family meeting turns into a firing squad rehearsal. Loyalty and betrayal standing only a few paces apart. These final camps are not just backdrops. They are, in the truest sense, the physical embodiment of the game's message. When a dream outlives its time, it does not simply fade into memory. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's dream refused to die with them. So it curdled, turned inward, and began devouring the people still clinging to it. By the time the last camp breaks, the question is no longer where the gang will go next, but who will crawl out of the wreckage at all. By Beaver Hollow, that wreckage has a face, and it is the face of a man who has finally had enough. Arthur Morgan, the first son of the van der Linde gang, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy from its humble beginnings, reaches the point where loyalty stops being a virtue and becomes a crime. The story of his last days is, in the truest sense, a story of a son turning to his father and saying, "No more." From the very beginning, Arthur's instinct is to defend Dutch. At Coulter, at Horseshoe Overlook, at Clemens Point, he backs Dutch in front of the others, smoothing over doubts, explaining away failures as bad luck or outside pressure. When John questions Dutch after Blackwater, Arthur snaps at him, framing Dutch as the only one holding this fragile family together. Even as the world was changing and the old ways were dying, Arthur clings to the belief that Dutch still has a plan worth following. That faith does not shatter in one moment. It erodes, mission by mission, body by body. Hosea's death at the St. Denis Bank is the first real crack. Arthur watches Dutch's big score kill the man who always argued for smaller jobs, quieter exits, real freedom instead of grand gestures. Then Guarma, the chaos with Cornwall, the needless violence in Strawberry and Annesburg, each failed heist becomes another piece of evidence that Dutch's dreams have curdled into delusions. By Beaver Hollow, Arthur stops defending and starts confronting. He brings up Hosea directly, throws those lost years and lost lives back at Dutch's feet. He points to the trail of dead Sean, Lenny, Hosea, and asks in so many words what all this sacrifice has actually bought. He calls out Micah's sudden rise, the way this latecomer whispers in Dutch's ear and pushes the gang toward cruelty rather than escape. Arthur is not trying to win an argument. He is trying to pull a father back from the edge. Dutch's response is not reflection. It is wounded pride. Every plea Arthur makes is heard as an accusation, every concern as betrayal. When Arthur questions Micah, Dutch hears a challenge to his authority. When Arthur invokes Hosea's memory, Dutch treats it as an attempt to undermine his leadership instead of a desperate reminder of who they once were. The irony is brutal. The man who preached freedom cannot tolerate someone he raised choosing to think freely. This is the real showdown of Red Dead Redemption 2. Not outlaw versus law, not Dutch versus the Pinkertons, but conscience versus charisma. In that dim, rotting camp, Arthur chooses truth over the man who taught him to read, ride, and rob. He chooses the world as it really is over the fantasy Dutch keeps selling. And once a son makes that choice, what is left of the family that called itself a gang? So when Arthur rides with John up that bleak, burning mountain, the so-called family is already dead. What remains is something smaller, quieter, and, in the truest sense, more real. One outlaw trying to make sure another does not repeat his entire life as a mistake. The ride itself is a deliberate echo of the past. From its humble beginnings, the gang's great journeys were always framed as rides toward some promised score, some distant freedom Dutch swore was waiting over the next ridge. Arthur rode beside him to Coulter, to Horseshoe Overlook, to Clemens Point and beyond, chasing a dream that shrank every time the camp moved. Now, the horses pound up the rock and dust not for gold, not for glory, but for escape. No speeches about civilization, no grand philosophy about the world being against them. Just two men, one dying, one still with a chance, racing away from a camp that has become the living embodiment of betrayal. On that climb, Arthur's role shifts. He is no longer the enforcer riding point for Dutch's plan. He becomes the escort for John's future. He tells John again and again to go, to take Abigail and Jack, to get as far from Dutch's shadow as the world will allow. It is a rejection of the old ways in the clearest possible terms. Dutch once claimed they were fighting for freedom, for family, for a place beyond the reach of civilization's noose. Arthur finally sees that the only real rebellion left is to walk away from that fantasy, to refuse to drag another generation into the same doomed story of dreams and delusions. Helping John is not just kindness, it is revision. When Dutch and Hosea found Arthur at the very beginning, they rescued a lost soul, but they also molded him into a weapon for their own ideals. No one ever told that boy to leave, to grow beyond the gang, to build a life that did not depend on robbery and running. Arthur cannot rewrite his own past, but he can change the script for John. In pushing him toward a ranch, a family, a small and fragile peace, Arthur is doing for John what no one did for him. Is that not its own form of redemption? This is where the game answers its central question. The blood spilled cannot be unspilled. The bodies buried from Blackwater to Beaver Hollow do not rise. Arthur's lungs are failing. His time is gone. His crimes are carved into the land. But someone still has to pay for all of it. Will it be the son again, and then the grandson after him? Or will the cost finally stop here, on this mountain, with a man who chooses to die so that another can live differently? In that choice, Arthur breaks the cycle Dutch could never abandon. He accepts that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and he refuses to drag John down with them. The gang's grand dream collapses into something far smaller. One family on one little patch of earth, trying to live honest in a dishonest world. And that fragile hope is what the epilogue will test next. That fragile hope is what gives Arthur's last ride its weight. Because the game does not hand him a single fixed martyrdom, it lets the end bend around the life he has actually lived. In the truest sense, his death is not just a cutscene, it is a verdict. From its humble beginnings, this was a story of choices wrapped in gunfights and train robberies. That all crystallizes on the mountain, when Arthur must decide, turn back for the gang's blood-soaked money, or help John escape to that tiny dream of family and freedom. One path clings to Dutch's old philosophy of one more score, one more plan, one more lie. The other path breaks with it completely, accepting that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that survival means letting the treasure go. Which future matters more, a satchel of cash or a father riding home? Layered over that is honor, the quiet ledger the game has been keeping from the very beginning. If Arthur has lived with a measure of compassion, resisting the worst impulses of the outlaw life, his final stand becomes something close to a benediction. Beaten, bleeding, betrayed by Micah and abandoned by Dutch, he still drags himself up that ridge, not to save a plan, but to buy John one last chance. When he finally collapses, facing the sunrise, there is no grand speech, no miracle rescue. There is only acceptance. That sunrise is the living embodiment of what his story has become. Arthur has confessed his failures, tried to make amends, and chosen to protect a smaller, truer form of family instead of a dying dream of revolution. His death feels like a spiritual release, not because the world forgives him, but because he has finally stopped lying to himself. Freedom, for once, is not a train to rob or a country to flee to. It is the ability to die knowing that in the end, he did the hard thing Dutch never could. But if his honor is low, the mountain tells a different story. The same climb turns uglier, more chaotic, more petty. Arthur's last moments are choked with bitterness, his face shoved into the dirt, his body left in shadow rather than greeted by dawn. Help John or chase the money, the feeling's the same. A man who never learned, a lost soul crushed under the very greed and cruelty he spent a lifetime dealing out. This is not redemption, it is consequence. By letting behavior shape every detail of Arthur's last ride, the game turns the ending into a mirror. Did he become loyal or selfish, protective or predatory, capable of letting go or chained to delusions? What happens on that ridge is, in a very real way, what has been valued all along. And in the epilogue, that choice does not stay buried with Arthur. It echoes forward, waiting to see what John will do when the past rides back into his world. Arthur's last choice turns the camera back on the gang, but the game is not only judging one man on a ridge, it is closing the book on an entire way of life. The story of the Vanderlinde gang is, in the truest sense, a funeral march for the Old West myth itself. From the very beginning in Coulter, huddled in that blizzard after Blackwater, the gang presents itself as a found family, clinging to Dutch's promise of freedom, loyalty, and a better world beyond the reach of civilization. The snow, the isolation, the desperate robberies on the mountainside, all of it feels like a throwback to an earlier age. The law is distant, the railroad a rumor, the frontier still pretending to be wild. But even there, the world was changing. The Pinkertons are already on their trail. Cornwall's money already owns the tracks beneath their horses' hooves. From its humble beginnings on that frozen ridge, every camp move becomes a quiet eulogy for the frontier. Horseshoe Overlook, perched above the budding sprawl of Valentine, looks open and hopeful at first. Yet the train robberies, the bounties, the constant talk of Blackwater show that ledgers, telegraphs, and wanted posters now move faster than any horse. Freedom is already being itemized and filed. At Clemens Point, the gang settles on a southern plantation's edge, shaded by Spanish moss and old money. Here, Dutch plays at being a gentleman revolutionary, drifting between Rhodes and Caliga Hall, caught in someone else's feud. The gang is no longer raiding faceless banks in the wilderness. It is entangled in the decaying hierarchies of an agrarian world being swallowed by railroads and industrial capital. Who really has power in this story now? The outlaw with a pistol, or the man with a company charter and a private army? Shady Belle pushes them closer to the heart of civilization. St. Denis looms, the living embodiment of modern America. Factories, electric lights, immigrant labor, and a bank that might as well be a fortress. Hosea still dreams of one last modest score and a quiet life, but Dutch now chases grand gestures, staging a theatrical robbery in a city built on insurance, interest, and surveillance. When Hosea and Lenny die on those marble steps, it is not only a bad plan failing, it is an old philosophy colliding with a system that has already accounted for men like Dutch. By Beaver Hollow, the pattern is complete. The gang is driven into a diseased cave, hemmed in by Pinkertons, railroads, and oil fields. Dutch muttering plans while Micah whispers poison. This fall is not just about betrayal or one rat in the ranks. It is about a world that no longer has room for people who live outside ledgers, borders, and barbed wire. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's dream, once idealistic, has become a story of delusions refusing to recognize that death. In the end, their campfires were never permanent homes. They were crossroads, marking the slow extinction of a fantasy that anyone could live forever beyond consequence, beyond history, beyond systems bigger than them. The gang's rise and collapse turns the classic Western into a question. What happens when a lost soul, or an entire family of them, keeps chasing freedom in a world that has already been measured, fenced, and sold? The answer will not end with Dutch or with Arthur's last ride. It waits in the epilogue, on a lonely ranch in a half-built house, where John Marston has to decide what kind of world his son will inherit, and what it truly costs to walk away from the ashes of the Old West. But to understand what those ashes mean, the story has to return to the man who lit the fire. Dutch van der Linde begins as a prophet of freedom, railing against railroads and robber barons, insisting that the world is rigged against the poor and the powerless. From its humble beginnings, the gang is told it is not merely stealing. It is striking back at a corrupt civilization that has forgotten honor and decency. In the very beginning, Dutch's speeches about family and equality have weight. He talks about giving the boy Arthur a home, about rescuing John from a life of petty crime, about protecting women and children from the worst of the world. Rob the rich, never the poor. Kill only when forced. Live by a philosophy, not by pure appetite. In those early camps, when Hosea pushes for small jobs and quiet retirements, Dutch at least pretends to listen. Then Blackwater happens. Hosea dies, and something inside Dutch cracks. The old ways were dying, and instead of adapting, he doubles down. The same words remain on his tongue, but they curdle. "We are not criminals. We are outlaws," he insists, even as the gang slaughters innocents during the St. Denis escape. One more job, he promises at Shady Bell, then at Beaver Hollow, then in the mountains, each time dragging everyone deeper into a nightmare that was once a dream. His language becomes a ritual, a spell he casts on others and on himself. "I have a plan. We just need money. They betrayed me." The details change: a bank in St. Denis, a train for Cornwall, a fantasy of Tahiti, but the refrain never does. When he leaves John to die on the bridge, when he murders Cornwall in cold blood, when he abandons Arthur in the chaos of Guarma, Dutch keeps insisting this is all for freedom and family. Yet every choice proves that the only freedom he truly protects is his own ego. Micah Bell does not invent that ego. He simply learns how to feed it. Where Hosea challenged Dutch, Micah flatters him. Where Arthur questions, Micah agrees. He whispers that the Pinkertons are everywhere, that dissent is betrayal, that only Dutch sees the truth. Pride, a need to be worshipped, and a terror of being wrong were always there, buried beneath the charm. Micah just digs them up and turns them into weapons. In the truest sense, Dutch becomes the living embodiment of a warning. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an idealistic philosophy rotting from the inside because its leader refuses to evolve. What happens when a man who once fought the powerful becomes indistinguishable from the tyrants he hated? What happens when a family built on freedom is held together only by fear? The answer is written in every corpse Dutch leaves behind, but it will take Arthur's final stand and John's hard-won future to show whether anyone truly escapes that shadow. Arthur Morgan becomes the answer to that shadow. Not through a miracle, not through a clean slate, but through the slow, painful realization that the story he has served his whole life was a lie. From the very beginning, Arthur is the loyal enforcer, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. He robs, beats, and kills in the name of freedom and family, convinced that the gang's crimes are righteous because the world is rigged. When he rides to the Downs farm to collect a debt, He is not a monster in his own eyes. He is a provider doing what must be done. Only later, when Edith Downs is reduced to prostitution, and Archie glares at him with pure hatred, does that memory begin to rot in his chest. That is the first crack. Others follow. The Native American storyline at the Wapiti Reservation forces Arthur to see Dutch's plan collide with a people who have already been destroyed by the same civilization he claims to resist. Rain's Fall is everything Dutch pretends to be: thoughtful, restrained, painfully aware that the old ways were dying. When Dutch manipulates Eagle Flies into a doomed rebellion, Arthur finally watches the gang's supposed ideals become a weapon against the very victims of progress. Then comes the diagnosis. Tuberculosis turns the unstoppable outlaw into a dying man, and in the truest sense, it turns his whole life into evidence. Every cough is a reminder that time is almost gone, that every ride could be the last. Faced with that truth, Arthur's redemption is not about erasing his sins. It is about what he chooses to do after he finally sees them. Who does he protect? What does he walk away from? What does he stand for when there is nothing left to win? He begins to apologize. To the Downs family, to John, to those he failed. He helps strangers without payment, defends the weak without Dutch's approval, and starts to measure loyalty not as blind obedience, but as responsibility. The game quietly dismantles a certain kind of masculinity, the stoic, violent provider who never questions orders. In its place, Arthur learns vulnerability, doubt, and care, even as his body fails. The multiple endings crystallize this inner shift. If Arthur clings to Dutch and his own pride, he dies scrambling in the mud, consumed by betrayal and rage. If he turns toward John's escape and embraces compassion, he dies facing the sunrise, at peace with the world that is killing him. The outcome is the same. The meaning is not. Arthur's final ride is a story of choice in a world that seems set in stone. The world was changing, the gang was doomed, the past could not be undone. But in those last hours, the lost soul Dutch once rescued becomes something else entirely. Proof that even as the dream collapses, a man can still decide what kind of ending he earns. But that choice, that hard-won redemption, unfolds under a sky already claimed by smoke and telegraph wire. Arthur's story of awakening sits inside a larger engine, one that does not care whether he dies noble or bitter, only that the rails stay clear and the oil keeps flowing. From the very beginning, the game has been quietly threading that engine through the background. Leviticus, Cornwall's trains, his railroads, his oil fields outside Valentine and in the heartlands, his government contracts that put Pinkertons on retainer. These are not separate villains. They are cogs in a single machine, turning land into property, labor into numbers on a ledger, human lives into a cost of doing business. The world was changing, and every scorched farm, every fenced pasture, every dynamited bridge is another receipt stamped with Cornwall's name. On the surface, the gang clashes with faces. Milton on the riverboat, Ross in the marsh, the Pinkertons storming Shady Bell and Beaver Hollow. Men with names, tempers, petty cruelties. But those men are only the visible edge of something much larger, the living embodiment of a new order that moves through contracts, charters, and sealed envelopes rather than gun belts. When Milton dies in the mountains, nothing stops. When Cornwall falls bleeding on the St. Denis docks, his trains do not halt in mourning. Another investor, another board, another official steps in, and the timetable keeps running on time. This is where the game becomes, in the truest sense, a story of power rather than just a story of outlaws. Dutch imagines an enemy he can see and shoot, a rival gang, a cruel magnate, a corrupt lawman. Yet the Pinkertons answer to Washington, and Washington answers to bondholders, and the bondholders answer only to profit. The old ways were dying not because of one man's greed or one agency's zeal, but because an entire civilization had decided that wilderness without fences was wasted potential. So the game never allows a victory over the system itself. Trains can be robbed but not dismantled. Oil rigs can be burned but not outlawed. Agents, guards, foremen, and tycoons can fall under Arthur's gun. Yet St. Denis grows brighter, Blackwater grows richer, and new telegraph poles march across the horizon. What does revenge mean against something that does not bleed? For the von der Linde gang, this is the final twist of the knife. From its humble beginnings, the gang believed it was fighting lawmen, rival outfits, and personal betrayal. In truth, it is being erased by a world order that barely notices the resistance. To the ledgers in St. Denis and the offices in Washington, Dutch, Arthur, and John are not legendary outlaws or tragic heroes. They are a rounding error. The question that lingers is cruel and simple. If the machine cannot be killed, can anyone truly escape it? Or do some ghosts just learn to live inside its shadow? The answer the story offers does not arrive with Dutch on a cliff or Arthur in a field. It arrives with a man hammering fence posts into stubborn ground. John Marston's epilogue is, in the truest sense, a story of what happens when the ghosts do not vanish, but learn to live beside a kitchen table. From the very beginning at Beecher's Hope, John is trying to do something radically unromantic. He is not chasing a score, a train, or a grand philosophy. He is chasing a roof that does not leak, a bank loan that clears, a son who reads books instead of gun catalogs. Every chore, every argument with Abigail, every awkward conversation with Jack is an act of resistance against the legend of the lone outlaw. In a world where the old ways were dying, John is attempting to bury them with his own hands, yet the past refuses to stay buried. To build that ranch, John is dragged back into gunfights with loan sharks, rustlers, and the remnants of the violent frontier he once helped sustain. The world keeps insisting he is the living embodiment of the Old West, a man whose only real skill is killing. The irony is cruel. To become a farmer, he must become a gunman again. To secure a quiet life, he must make war on the noise that followed him from gang camps and burned out towns. In this tension, Arthur's lesson echoes. Arthur could not outrun who he was, but he chose who he was doing it for. John walks the same road from a different angle. Each time he holsters the gun and picks up a hammer, each time he rides home instead of chasing one more bounty, he is answering Arthur's death with a different kind of courage. The question is no longer whether freedom lies beyond the horizon, but whether it can exist inside a fence line. Abigail, Jack, and the homestead become the game's quiet counter-argument to Dutch's grand speeches. Dutch promised freedom through motion, through robbery, through defiance of civilization. Beecher's hope whispers a different possibility, that real freedom might live in responsibility, in limits, in the mundane rituals of family. Is John more trapped fixing that roof than he was riding with the gang? Or is this the first time his choices are not dictated by someone else's delusions? The epilogue answers with bittersweet clarity. The Old West dies not only in collapsing gangs and Pinkerton gunfire, but in small, ordinary decisions to stay, to work, to love. John's final stand on that porch mirrors Arthur on the ridge. Both men face the past head on, knowing it will likely kill them. One dies trying to buy time for a doomed family of outlaws. The other dies trying to buy time for an actual family to leave the story. It is a bridge between eras and a warning. The dream of the outlaw can end, but its shadow lingers in what the survivors choose to build next. That is the bridge the game is really interested in. Not just between two eras of the West, but between fantasy and responsibility, between the dream of freedom and the cost of actually living it. From its humble beginnings around two conmen and a scared teenager, this was always a story of a family trying to outrun the world, and of a world that refused to stop closing in. Seen from the very beginning to the very end, the Van der Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of a larger machine grinding forward. Dutch's idealistic philosophy, his talk of civilization as a cage and the outlaw as a free man, collides again and again with railroads, Pinkertons, and Cornwall's oil fields. Every camp move, from the snow of Coulter to the rot of Beaver Hollow, traces the same pattern. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's dream could not change with them. His better world curdles into paranoia and betrayal, until freedom means nothing more than doing what Dutch wants. In the truest sense, his rebellion against the system becomes its mirror image. He talks about loyalty while abandoning Hosea's caution. He preaches family while leaving John to bleed in the snow. He claims to hate civilization's cruelty while handing that old man to Bronte's men and watching a woman drown in a swamp. What is that, if not another tyrant in a different hat? Against that, Arthur's arc stands as a quiet revolution. A man raised to believe that shooting and stealing were proof of strength discovers that real strength is choosing who to protect when it no longer benefits him. His honor, tracked in small choices and final words, turns a dying outlaw into something else. A man who refuses the lie. Is freedom just running from consequence? Or is it finally accepting what has been done and deciding to do better with what remains? John's fragile homestead at Beecher's Hope answers that question in worn fence posts and unpaid banknotes. His life becomes a story of compromise and persistence, of an outlaw trying to build something that is not just another campfire waiting to be stamped out. Yet even there, the system reaches in through mortgages, government threats, and the lingering violence he cannot quite bury. The dream does not vanish. It mutates into a quieter, more ordinary struggle. That is where this tale of cowboys and Pinkertons turns back on the present. The game uses the death of the Old West to talk about modern work, power, and the stories people tell themselves at night to feel righteous. Who is the Dutch in a boardroom, insisting there is a plan while chasing ego? Who is the Arthur at a desk, realizing the cost of looking away? Who is the John on a small patch of land, trying to give a different life to the next generation? In the end, Red Dead Redemption 2 is not just a story of how an outlaw family falls apart. It is a question about what comes after the fall. Freedom without responsibility is just another fantasy, another campfire in the rain. Real redemption lives in the decision to protect rather than possess, to build rather than flee, to tell a truer story when the old myths have finally burned out. The world was changing then, as it is now. The old ways were dying then, as many are now. The game has shown what that cost looks like. The final choice rests outside its borders. What kind of better world will actually be built, and what will be left behind to make room for it?